Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. My name is Craig Hickman. I am the state senator for Senate District 14, 11 towns in Southern Kennebec County. I'm the Senate chair of this fourth meeting of the Commission to Study Increased Housing Opportunities in Maine by Studying Zoning and Land Use Restrictions. I butchered that, but I think everybody knows what we're here for, so pardon me for that. There are a few of us here in the building, in the committee room, which is why I am masked, and most of us seem to be participating remotely, which is completely understandable under the circumstances. And so before we introduce Ms. Risler to go through our agenda for the day, I will take introductions from commission members on the order of what's in front of my screen. Beginning first within the room, Commissioner Spalding.
Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon. It's Heather Spalding from Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association.
Senator Pouliot.
Hey, good afternoon. State Senator Matt Pouliot. I represent Senate District 15, currently the towns of Augusta, China, Oakland City, and Vassalboro.
Commissioner Hill.
Good afternoon, Madeline Hill, and I am here representing the Maine Association of Realtors.
Commissioner Dufour.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Dufour, and I represent the Maine Municipal Association.
Commissioner Golek.
Good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Golek. I'm from Harpswell, Maine, and I'm representing Maine Equal Justice Partners and Maine Equal Justice Partners Circle.
Commissioner Pingree.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hannah Pingree, representing the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future.
Commissioner Totman.
Good afternoon. I'm Dana Totman with Avesta Housing.
Commissioner Brennan.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Brennan. I'm the Director of Maine State Housing Authority.
Commissioner Jackson.
Hey, y'all. I'm Anthony Jackson. I'm here on behalf of Racial Equity and Justice.
Representative Arata.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Arata, and I represent House District 65, which includes New Gloucester and part of Poland.
Commissioner Napolitano.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm John Napolitano. I'm the president of the Maine State Building and Construction Trades Council.
The speaker will join us in a little while. He has a overlapping commitment, but he certainly looks forward to being here as soon as he can arrive. We have with us also today in the room, Deirdre Snyder from OPLA, Hillary Risler from OPA, Sam Prower from OPLA. And it looks as though Sam Prower, because he has been the one getting all of this together for us, doing great work to disseminate all the information. He is going to walk us through our agenda and lead today what will be more like a work session than a presentation. So with that, Sam, you're on.
All right. Thank you, Senator Hickman. Good afternoon, commission members. So yeah, as Senator Hickman said, I'm just going to walk through the agenda at first and then give you a little breakdown of what materials we've provided you for today's meeting. So as you'll see, the first item on today's meeting after the introductions is our office. We're going to provide you an overview of land use and zoning laws that affect housing in Maine. And we've also asked a number of representatives from relevant state agencies to be present to help answer any questions that you might have. After that, obviously, there's a public comment period, and then there's some time set aside for the commission to discuss or to begin discussing potential findings or recommendations if time permits. And then as usual, there'll be discussion of next steps as in the next commission meeting and so forth. So for our overview of land use and zoning laws, we've broken it down into more or less 3 or 4 parts. So we're going to start out with a general overview. And what I am planning to do is actually, because this area is so broad, explain to you some of the handouts we've prepared. And as you'll see, they're really a high level view rather than a specific view, because there are so many laws in Maine that touch on this area. And the intent of this will be for us to kind of give you a quick reference place to start from. And then if you have more or deeper questions, we have the agency members available, and obviously we can provide additional research at your request. A couple things I also just wanted to note for you that were, if you're here in person, are in your packets, or if you're attending remotely, are in the emails we provided. There is, in addition to what we prepared, an excerpt from the OFPR compendium about transfers for municipal revenue sharing, and kind of how that works. And we also have, which Hillary's going to walk you through, a memo on providing background on court rulings regarding exclusionary zoning. And we've got a list for you of affordable housing provisions that were in bills that were carried over from the first regular session to the second regular session of the 130th legislature. And with that, I'm going to start off with the document titled State Level Laws That Impact Zoning and Land Use in Maine. And for those attending in person, this packet is in blue. So what we've provided, and I admit this document is going to be much more useful for you electronically than it is in the hard copy, because we've included a lot of active hyperlinks. So everything that's underlined is a link to the relevant statutory provisions. What we've provided is a brief overview of Municipal Home Rule Authority, a brief overview of Maine revised statutes. So these are laws that affect municipal planning and land use. And then we've provided a brief overview of additional laws that affect land use and planning in Maine. And some of these include shoreline zoning laws, information about river corridor commissions, information about the Land Use and Planning Commission, minimum lot sizes for waste disposal, traffic movement permits, and tiny homes. And in addition, on the last page of that, we have information about the enforcement of land use and zoning laws. And I just wanted to stop here. I'm happy to walk through each of these on this reference guide for you. I just didn't know. I just want to know what way would that be useful for you, or do you want me to keep going and describing the documents first?
Whatever makes the most sense. I just want to check with commissioners to make sure that everyone has received these documents via email. And so if I don't see any hands up to say they don't have them or can't find them in their email, so we're good to go.
Okay. And I did remember Deirdre is going to give an overview of the state level kind of like home rule and municipal zoning and how that affects shoreline zoning after this presentation as well.
Perfect. Thank you. And I will also say, commissioners, if you have any questions while the presentation is happening, just feel free to raise your hand and we can be a little organic about how we have a dialogue about this part. So it's not just completely 100% undidactic. But with that said, please present to us this amazing compilation of law.
All right. So the second piece of this, and I'm not going to read through these in particular because it ended up being about 20 pages. We have put together selected statutory excerpts from Maine law in order to try to be helpful for you. And these, the idea here was really to give you the ability to look at the things that are in a little more detail that are on the quick reference guide without having to go find it yourself. It's not comprehensive. As I mentioned, there's a lot in the Maine revised statutes on these issues. But some of the areas that we cover the Municipal Home Rule Authority, both in the Constitution of Maine and in the Maine revised statutes. We have many of the provisions related to municipal zoning ordinances and municipal planning. There are references here to things like shoreline zoning and rate of growth and growth management within municipalities. And then there are also references to subdivisions. We have references to development laws and additional programs within these chapters, that reference like loans to financial institutions, construction loans, housing opportunities for Maine programs, energy preservation of moderate income and low income housing constructed with federal assistance. And so, as I mentioned before, the second part of this packet really is just to kind of give you something that you can pull up and for your conversations now and help you figure out what you want to go into even more depth on. And with that, I might, unless there are specific questions about these documents, I might turn it over to Deirdre to kind of walk through some of the municipal zoning like basics.
Thank you, Sam. Are there any questions from commissioners regarding the packet of documents that we have as he has briefed us? Seeing none. Thank you.
If I may just quickly interject, I just want to let the public know, for anybody who's watching on YouTube or attending via Zoom, that all of these documents are being posted on the commission website as we speak. And so if you're wondering what we're talking about, we're getting that all up as soon as we can.
Thank you, Hillary. That's very important for the public who are listening, watching on YouTube or listening in to understand. And that our website is, do you have the link? Can I just say it out loud? What is it? The link to our website?
Yes, I can. I can put it in the chat on the Zoom, as well as send it out to the IP list again.
That'd be great.
For anyone who's looking for it.
That'd be great. I appreciate that very much. It will keep it fresh in people's email boxes. Welcome.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
There we go.
Used this one before, it's new. Thank you. So Sam had mentioned the sort of guide that he's provided, and this is a very broad, high level, little more in detail of zoning in Maine, the municipal level. And then I'll go into some more detail specifically about shoreline zoning, since I think there was some desire to hear about that, and because it kind of impact the development of housing. So in Maine, municipalities have broad authority to adopt ordinances that regulate land use within municipal borders. In the unorganized and deorganized areas of the state, including townships and plantations, the Land Use Planning Commission serves as the planning and zoning authority. At Maine statute, at Title 30A, Section 3001, which is also referenced in the guide, there's a support for this strong local power in municipal planning. It specifies that any municipality, by the adoption, amendment, or repeal of ordinances or bylaws, may exercise any power or function which the legislature has power to confer upon it, which is not denied either expressly or by clear implication, and exercise any power or function granted to that municipality by the Constitution of Maine, general law, or charter. However, there are instances in which the state imposes limitations on home rule authority or establishes requirements if municipalities choose to regulate land uses through the adoption of ordinances. For example, in Chapter 187, Subchapter 3 of Title 30A, the law requires that the public be provided with an adequate opportunity to be heard in the preparation of a zoning ordinance. A zoning ordinance must be pursuant to and consistent with a comprehensive plan adopted by the municipality. A zoning map describing each zone or modifications to those zones must be adopted as part of a zoning ordinance. And any municipality that adopts a zoning ordinance is required to establish a board of appeals, as well as other requirements. There are numerous other provisions in statute that constrain municipal home rule authority in relation to planning and land use. The quick reference guide provides links to some of those other areas of Maine law that limit that authority. In addition to the statutory limitations on municipal planning and land use, there are instances in law where municipalities are directed to regulate land use in a specific manner. One such example is the Mandatory Shoreline Zoning Act. The Mandatory Shoreline Zoning Act, which was enacted in 1971, requires municipalities to adopt, administer, and enforce local ordinances that regulate land use activities within the shoreline zone. Minimum standards are created by rule, which are routine technical rules, by the Department of Environmental Protection with their Board of Environmental Protection. However, there are statutory provisions in the Mandatory Shoreline Zoning Act that specify certain requirements for those adopted rules. But the meat of shoreline zoning are in rules, and that's a Chapter 1000 rule, which is also linked in your reference guide. So for context, the shoreline zone is comprised of all land area within 250 feet horizontal distance of the normal high water line of any great pond or river, the upland edge of a coastal wetland, including all areas affected by tidal action, upland edge of a defined freshwater wetland, and all land area within 75 feet horizontal distance of the normal high water line of certain streams. Minimum standards within the Chapter 1000 rule include requirements for minimum structure setback, lot area required per residential dwelling unit, and shore frontage. It also includes the various districts that the use is allowed in those districts and the entity that may grant permits for those uses if permits are required. It also establishes requirements for legally existing non-conforming structures and uses, including the expansion of those non-conforming structures or the replacement of non-conforming structures. The Chapter 1000 rules governing shoreline zoning are viewed as sort of a model ordinance. Municipalities are permitted to be more stringent than what is in the rule, and under certain circumstances may be less stringent if the conditions warrant it and there is approval by the department for that. The adoption or amendment to municipality shoreline zoning ordinance must be reviewed and approved by the department no matter what, if they're being the same, stringent, less stringent. Anytime you make an adjustment to that ordinance, it has to be submitted for approval to make sure that it's consistent with both the act and the rules. There are various districts that are laid out within the Chapter 1000 rules. Municipalities, again, could tailor and make their own districts, but the districts within the Chapter 1000 rules include a resource protection, limited residential, limited commercial, general development 1, general development 2, and then commercial fisheries and maritime activities, and a stream protection district. The most restrictive of all those districts is resource protection, and that district is generally more restrictive because it's seen as development would likely adversely affect water quality, productive habitat, biological ecosystems, or scenic and natural character. As stated earlier, the rules establish minimum lot standards. The rules specify that within the shoreline zone adjacent to tidal areas, you need a minimum of 30,000 square feet per residential dwelling unit and at least 150 feet of shore frontage. Within shoreline areas in non-tidal areas, you would need a minimum of 40,000 square feet per residential dwelling unit and a minimum of 200 feet of frontage. And for reference, a residential dwelling unit is defined specifically as a room or a group of rooms designed and equipped exclusively for use as permanent, seasonal, or temporary living quarters for only one family at a time and containing cooking, sleeping, and toilet facilities. The term shall include mobile homes and rental units that contain cooking, sleeping, and toilet facilities regardless of the time period rendered. And recreational vehicles are not residential dwelling units. So for a one-family home in a non-tidal area, you would need 40,000 square feet of land, and in a tidal area, you would need 30,000 square feet of land. There are numerous components to Chapter 1000. This is just touching the tip of it, and in the act itself. Like I said, Sam has provided a link to those documents, and we can always get further information if you need that. In addition to zoning at the municipal level, there are also several state administered laws that govern land use.
Deirdre, if you could just pause for
Yep.
1 second. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to the commission real quickly to see if folks have any questions or thoughts about the shoreline zoning. Okay, great. Let's keep moving on then.
And I'm almost done.
That's great. I just wanted to
So-
check in with the commission. That's okay.
Yeah.
Thank
So,
you.
in addition to zoning at the municipal level, there are several state administered laws that govern land use. A few examples, and I'm not going to go into details of these, are the Natural Resources Protection Act, which regulates activities in, on, over, or adjacent to natural resources such as lakes, wetlands, streams, rivers, fragile mountain areas, and sand dune systems. And obviously, there's some overlap here with that with the shoreline zoning. And the Site Location of Development Act, which regulates developments that may have a substantial impact impact on the environment, and those are provided in law. And one such area that is sometimes captured under site law is subdivisions. There's also the Maine Stormwater Management Law, which provides stormwater standards for projects located in organized areas of the state that include 1 or more acres of disturbed areas. So as you can see, there's a lot of components that go into the oversight of development throughout the state. And this is just highlighting a few of those areas. And like I said, the reference guide also has links to these in more detail and some more information that may be helpful to the commission.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the commission for Deirdre before she passes the baton? Thank you so much for compiling this research for us. We have a lot of homework to do between now and our next meeting. Who's next?
So we apologize for doing a little bit of musical chairs
That's
today.
fine. That's fine. It's a team.
But as we mentioned, we are sort of trying to just very quickly go through a lot of information. And then what we can do is circle back sort of to the overall Maine laws, because as Sam Power mentioned when he was going over the agenda, is we were able to invite a number of people here representing some of the state agencies, including DAFS, Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, DEP, DECD, and DPS, which is the state fire marshal who's in charge of code enforcement, to be available for questions to go into some of the details of how these laws work in practice. But before we do that, I am here to briefly go over some legal background related to exclusionary zoning and the Fair Housing Act. You heard a lot of this mentioned during the last meeting. Morgan Williams from the National Fair Housing Alliance touched on a number of pieces of it, and we linked to a couple of his resources in our memorandum as well. Like my colleagues, I will not be just sitting here and reading through the entire memo for you, but I will touch on a couple of the major points and hopefully set the stage for the discussion going forward. And certainly there are a lot of laws, there's a lot of court cases out there. And so to the extent there are additional questions, either about the material that I'm providing or a specific scenario that you are thinking, or think specific recommendations that you might be thinking about, don't hesitate to ask a question. And if we don't know the answer, we'll certainly see what we can find for you for the next meeting.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start with the memo, which is specific on background on the US Supreme Court rulings regarding exclusionary zoning. What you heard during the last meeting, I think, about is that a lot of these exclusionary zoning policies really came to a head in the 1960s and 1970s, which is when a lot of these major court cases came down, and which ultimately led to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. I'm going to start with sort of the general exclusionary zoning laws. And the key points here really is that the explicitly racial or other directly class or category-based zoning policies are generally found to be unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment and illegal under the Fair Housing Act. However, zoning ordinances are generally permissible if they are not clearly arbitrary, unreasonable, having no substantial relation to the public health, safety, morals, or general welfare, even when those ordinances may result in a disparate impact on certain communities. Although I will note, of course, that under the Fair Housing Act, disparate impact on a protected class may still be prohibited, and I'll touch on that in a moment. One of the legal terms of art that came up at the last meeting that we wanted to make sure that you were clear on is this idea of what strict scrutiny is. And while we're not going to go into the intricacies and details of that legal test, essentially, when you have a law or an ordinance that is explicitly discriminatory against a racial or a protected class, the legislature must have passed that law to further a compelling government interest, and it must be narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. This is the highest standard of review that a court will use to evaluate the constitutionality of governmental discrimination. Briefly, there are, as you know, many types of exclusionary zoning, and there are a number of defenses that are usually raised in regards to exclusionary zoning challenges. These ordinances may achieve exclusionary zoning in a number of different ways. Most common have been by limiting the number of dwellings permitted through large lot zoning, the exclusion of multiple dwellings or multifamily homes, the exclusion or restriction of mobile homes, and various density restrictions, including but not limited to setback requirements, minimum frontage requirements, and lot coverage restrictions. What you'll find in a lot of the cases is that generally a court is weighing the public interest served by the regulation against the need for affordable housing. And a lot of those common defenses to those exclusionary zoning are those such as municipal finances, infrastructure and traffic considerations, property values, rural, historic, or unique community character, and of course, open space, agricultural land, and environmentally sensitive areas, which of course would include those ordinances related to, for example, shoreline zoning, which we just heard about. We provided an overview of some of the big cases that came down through the Supreme Court. I'm going to skip to the second case we have listed here, which is the Village of Euclid, Ohio, the Ambler Realty. This was a really big case that was back in 1926 that sort of opened the floodgates, if it were, for a lot of the zoning that later got challenged and led to the Fair Housing Act. And that is where that quote that I mentioned earlier, the court held that the locality's decision on the separation of uses within its own borders may be afforded substantial deference as long as the division is not clearly arbitrary and unreasonable, having no substantial relation to the public health, safety, morals, or general welfare. I'm not going to get into all the rest of the cases there, but another big case was in 1977. And this is on the next page, second paragraph. And this was the case of Arlington Heights v. Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation. And this was a case where they were dealing with a zoning ordinance in Chicago that was zoned for single family dwellings. And there had never been any variances issued on that. And so it prohibited the construction of multifamily units. And in that case, the court had upheld that ordinance, finding that there was no discriminatory intent or evidence of racial motivation. And I'm going to sort of put a pin in that as we get to some of the cases on Fair Housing Act, which recently have addressed this disparate impact, where maybe it doesn't look on its face that it is racially motivated, but that the statistics bear out that, in fact, perhaps, regardless of the intent, there is an absolute effect or disparate impact on that protected class. A couple really quick other areas of interest that I'm just going to mention. One of them is standing, and this can come up in a lot of cases. So as the commission, I'm sure, knows that to be able to sue, you have to have standing in court, usually to show a harm to yourself. And so standing is something that is often litigated prior to the court ever hearing or ever deciding the case on its merit. It's the question of whether the plaintiff in the case has shown the harm. And so that's an important thing to remember just in terms of cases when you're looking that may be something that comes up. Last but not least, I want to talk about inclusionary zoning, since I talked briefly about exclusionary zoning. And a number of states have passed laws attempting to create explicitly inclusionary zoning programs. And we can certainly bring you lists of those states if you would like some more information on them. But generally, these inclusionary zoning includes expedited permitting procedures and appeals mechanisms for affordable housing projects, can include requirements to include affordable housing in municipalities' comprehensive plans. And there's been some legislation enabling municipalities to adopt inclusionary zoning requirements. A lot of these have already come up in all of your discussions already through the commission's work, but these things include such as housing set-asides, inclusionary housing fees, zoning incentives for affordable housing preservation, as well as those things such as permitting accessory dwelling units and designating affordable senior housing. These really have not been addressed much at the Supreme Court level, but we did want to pull in a couple of important state cases that have been cited a lot. One of them is a case out of New Jersey, which is generally referred to as Mount Laurel 2. There was a Mount Laurel 1 years ago on a separate issue. But in this case, the New Jersey Supreme Court rejected the contention that mandatory set-asides are impermissible socioeconomic regulations. And they did so by explaining in their reasoning that it is nonsense to single out inclusionary zoning and label it socioeconomic if that is meant to imply that other aspects of zoning are not. Detached single-family residential zones, high-rise multifamily zones of any kind, indeed practically any significant kind of zoning now used has a substantial socioeconomic impact, and in some cases a socioeconomic motivation. And they commented that it would be ironic if inclusionary zoning to encourage the construction of lower-income housing were ruled beyond the power of a municipality because it is socioeconomic, when its need has arisen from the socioeconomic zoning of the past that excluded it. And so I included that in there only in its relation to those exclusionary zoning practices. The court also, at that time, rejected a contention of it being a taking, an unconstitutional taking, reasoning that the builder who undertakes the project that includes the mandatory set aside voluntarily assumes the financial burden, if any, of that condition. There was another case that's listed here that may be of interesting to you, and this had to do with high housing costs and subdividing a lot and housing prices. And the plaintiffs in that case lost at both the Superior Court and on appeal, and the Supreme Court decided not to hear it. No, so I just wanted to include that as well. And then I included a couple additional resources. These were actually part of the presentation at the last meeting from Morgan Williams from the National Fair Housing Alliance. They have a number of interesting cases there that are also relevant, and the links are available for those of you who received the electronic version and will be posted on the commission website.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the commission or any comments based upon this review of case law regarding exclusionary zoning and inclusionary zoning? Like I said, we have a lot of homework to do, and I am really happy about that.
So the one thing I said, oh, let's stick a pin in it, and that is the Fair Housing Act.
Yes.
So what I did, rather, we always try to be as efficient as possible. So I found a legal overview of the Fair Housing Act that is done by our OPLA's federal counterparts, the Congressional Research Service. And I do have hard copies for the two of you in the room, Sam, if you don't mind trying out the hard copies. Those of you also received a copy of this in your email.
Yes.
I'm going to touch on it just very briefly again with a quick summarization. This is from 2016. And so there is one update that I need to make you aware of that is out of date in this overview.
Okay.
So as I mentioned, the Fair Housing Act was enacted in 1968, and it was enacted to provide within constitutional limitations for fair housing throughout the United States. The original act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin in the sale or rental of housing, the financing of housing, or the provision of brokerage services, and then was amended in 1974 to add sex discrimination to the list of prohibited activities. I included for you an excerpt of the Maine Human Rights Act as well. I'm not going to go through that in detail, but I do want to highlight for you that in Maine, it applies to any discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, and sexual orientation, which is not included in the National Federal Housing Act, as well as physical or mental disability, religion, ancestry, national origin, or familial status.
And Hillary, can you tell me, you probably will answer this, but I don't mean to preempt that. Is this subchapter 4, fair housing of the Maine Human Rights Act as currently codified, does this have anything to do with the Fair Housing Act that was passed, that was brought up by Mr. O'Brien in his testimony presentation that Gerald E. Talbot had passed in Maine?
I'm not sure whether he was referring to this or something separate.
Okay, thank you.
I could certainly reach out and find out.
That'd be great. It would probably be in the historical record of how this came to be. I appreciate that very much.
So going back to the National Fair Housing Act, it applies broadly to all sorts of housing, public and private, including single family homes, apartments, condominiums, mobile homes, and others. and it also extends the secondary mortgage market. It does include some exceptions, and the example would be limiting the applicability of any reasonable local, state, or federal restrictions regarding the maximum number of occupants permitted to occupy a dwelling. As I mentioned, while the FHA prohibits discrimination based on sex, it does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. However, Maine's Fair Housing Act does include sexual orientation as a prohibition. In June 2015, the Supreme Court held in Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, the Inclusive Community Projects, that in addition to the intentional discrimination, which is what we were talking about with a lot of the exclusionary zoning, that disparate impact claims are also cognizable under the FHA. And so that was the big Supreme Court case that indicated those disparate impact treatment claims. However, although plaintiffs have historically faced fairly steep odds of getting their disparate impact claims past the preliminary stages of litigation, the court in that inclusive communities case issued some cautionary standards that some believe may result in even fewer successful disparate impact claims being raised in courts and a swifter disposal of claims that are raised. So the next point I want to make, so in July of 2015, HUD issued some final regulations designed to implement an FHA mandate that executive agencies administering HUD programs, as well as HUD grantees and other recipients of HUD funding, affirmatively further the FHA's goals of reducing segregation and housing barriers. So as I mentioned, that this particular overview was published in 2016. In 2018, those rules were indefinitely suspended. So this is the piece that is a little bit out of date. New rules were put in place in 2020. And I do know the Biden administration has issued an order for HUD to go back and look at both the repeal of these 2015 rules, as well as the new rules that were promulgated in 2020 to determine those impacts and what that looks like. So that is something that may come up again at the federal level. But it's good to make a note that in your notes that is not currently, those are not the rules that are in place at this time. And then last but not least, of course, enforcement. The Federal Housing Act may be enforced in varying ways by the Attorney General, by HUD, by victims of discrimination, and remedies include actual damages, punitive damages, equitable relief, and reasonable legal costs. And violators may also be assessed civil penalties. I am happy to go into any of that in more depth, although we do also have that overview for you, which goes through some of the legal tests involved and some of the cases that were a large part of that act and the current state of law.
Thank you. It seems, and this is just from this cursory glance at the summary, that even though there's a Fair Housing Act and the 14th Amendment, it has become very difficult over time to win any claims that exclusionary zoning is discriminatory.
Yeah, so I am certainly not an expert in the field, but I do think that is certainly something that has been true. I also know sort of at the federal level, there have not been a whole lot of recent big cases on this. A lot has been happening at the state level, which is one of the reasons why sometimes in different states, everyone's got their own constitution and their own Fair Housing Act. And so it can be a little bit difficult to put that all into one beautiful, cohesive, this is the state of the law.
Right. It would mean though that if Maine or any other state were going to try to address that, it will have to come from policy. It's not going to come in the courts necessarily. So it's up to us to do the work. That's my opinion. Are there any questions or comments from the commission on this overview of the Fair Housing Act as it relates to case law? Seeing none. Thank you. What is next?
Well, so at this point, we would sort of like a work session. We've thrown a lot of information at you. I can let you know who is here from the various state agencies that are available for questions.
That'd be great.
We do have Michael Allen from the Department of Administrative and Financial Services. I know there had been some questions about municipal revenue sharing, if that's something that you would like to hear about. We have Judith East from the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. They have information both in terms of the previous state planning office and the Land Use Planning Commission. We also have Nick Livesay, and I apologize in advance if I am mispronouncing any of these names, from Department of Environmental Protection in relation to a lot of the shoreline zoning and environmental enforcement. We have the Department of Economic and Community Development. Deborah Johnson is here and can provide some more information if there are any questions on HUD or CDBG funding. And then we also invited Richard McCarthy from the Department of Public Safety, Office of the State Fire Marshal. If there are any questions about some of the enforcement, either of the zoning enforcements or building code enforcement.
Well, I thank the administration for allowing all of these people to be available to us to answer any questions we may have today. I will hope that they might be available at our next meeting as well, since we are inundated with this review of the law. But with that said, I will turn to the commission now to see, based upon everything we've heard so far and what we've already discussed at our previous 3 meetings, if you have any specific questions from anyone who is here from the administration to answer them. Commissioner Pingree.
Thank you, Senator. It's a lot, and I know we're all looking at these many, many documents. So thank you, Hillary and Sam, for putting them together. And again, we are all, I can't say any of us are, maybe a few people can claim to be experts on Maine's land use laws, but this is a lot of different components and case law. So I think it's going to take us a little while to think about it. And I would say I was trying to think about it even as it related to one of our commissioners, Levine, sent a memo with some sort of starting ideas. So trying to understand some of those ideas and how they relate to Maine's current law. I even did some Google on like, is there a minimum lot size in Maine? And actually looked at some of the statutes, and there was actually a bunch of repealed statutes. So I'm sort of was gonna hit up Kate or somebody in this room for some history on whether this has evolved in any way in state law and why. But I do know that many of the people in the room are super helpful, and we've worked with them in my office on a number of issues. Like I think it would be helpful for the commission maybe if they could maybe introduce themselves a little more formally and talk about their work as it relates to housing and housing production. I know that Deb Johnson plays a role. Rich McCarthy does some important, I mean, so I think just a little more description of their office and program and how it relates to our work, it could be helpful. Not to go on a tangent, but I think we're all trying to understand who does what and how it works.
That's a great idea, Commissioner Pingree. And before we do that, are there any other suggestions or questions or comments from the commission before we do that? In that case, so that everyone feels that their time is being used efficiently, I'm going to go in the order of the representatives from the executive branch that are here today, and I will move Mr. Michael Allen into the, do I have to do that today, Hillary, to make sure that he can be heard, to move him into the room? Yes.
Yes, everyone I just mentioned should be available in the panelist.
Yes, I would like for someone to make me host so I can do that, or if not, whoever is the host, if you could please move Mr. Michael Allen into the panel.
I knew I was forgetting to do something at the beginning.
It's perfectly fine.
There we go.
It's all good. There we go. So Mr. Allen will be joining us shortly. There he is. Mr. Allen, please feel free to turn on your camera if you'd like, and certainly your audio.
While he is coming on, if I may, Senator, I do want to also mention that Commissioner Brennan had emailed us, and we forwarded to you a memo with some additional data as well.
Okay.
And so that should be in your packets.
So Thank you. I appreciate that very much, Commissioner Brennan, and we will look at that as well. I see a hand raised. Commissioner Topman.
Thank you, Senator. Before the officials start sharing their thoughts, it occurs to me that back in our duties in the legislation that created us is this item 4 that says, consider measures that would encourage increased housing options in the state, including but not limited to municipal incentives and state mandates. And so I'm wondering if when the state officials share their thoughts with us, if they could help us out a little bit, if there are any particular incentives or mandates coming from their department, which might flow to municipalities that might in fact affect the creation of more affordable housing. So it's just a thought, but it seems like we have this group here today, and we are going to have to wrestle with these incentives and mandates. And I think they may hold far more information than any of us.
Thank you, Commissioner. I have actually moved every person into the panel who has been invited to take questions, but I think with Commissioner Pingree suggestion, I don't see any response yet from Mr. Allen for turning on his camera and addressing us. So he may not at the moment be at his desk. Is Nick Livesay, are you here with us? Great.
I'm here with you. I don't see an option for turning on my camera.
Okay,
but if you can hear me, I can talk to you.
Let me make sure that maybe I am disabled so I can promote remove. Interesting. I don't see an option to allow you to turn. Let me see if there's another way. If you all give me 1 second, I may be able to figure this out.
We can also recruit some technical help if you want to start without the video.
Yes, that'd be great. You may proceed, sir, and we will figure out if there's a button down here at the bottom of my screen where I have to click on to allow everyone to turn on their video. But until we find that button, in the interest of time, please begin, introduce yourself and let us know what you do. And then if the commissioners have any questions for you thereafter, we will go from there.
Sure. So my name is Nick Livesay, and I'm the director of the Bureau of Land Resources within the Department of Environmental Protection. And my wardrobe today is not such that you're missing anything if you don't get to see me. I think Deirdre hit on, within our Bureau, we handle a lot of the development permitting in Maine, and probably the most germane area is the one that she spent the most time on, and that is shoreline zoning. And so I'll jump to that in a second. We do administer the Natural Resources Protection Act, which involves permitting of activities near certain protected natural resources. But unless you're in the resource, we only get 75 feet away. That's what adjacent means. So we're not talking about a very big area, and to the extent that density of development is of interest, probably shoreline zoning is a better place to focus. We also administer the site location of development law, or site law, and that does contain some authority for us over subdivisions. But the term subdivision in site law has a unique definition. So it's different than the definition of subdivision that comes into play in municipal contexts, where it's creation of 3 or more lots within a 5-year period. And so ours is a lot more complicated, but the upshot is that we only get into subdivision regulation on the residential side of things, typically when there are 15 lots or more, and we don't get into minimum lot sizes and density. That's left to municipal zoning. So really, I think for your group's interest is probably shoreline zoning may or may not be a place that you want to focus, but if any, that's what it would be. And as Deirdre outlined, there are the way that it works. The department has a chapter 1000 rule. Oh, this will probably get you the video.
I figured it out. I promoted you to panelist, and that makes it work instead of just allowing you to talk.
I've come through the
There you are.
there you go. All right. It's cold in my house today, so I got my vest on. Chapter 1000 is the rule that the department administers, and that contains minimum guidelines for shoreline zoning, and all the towns have to have something that's no less stringent and comparable. And we do regulate setbacks from water bodies primarily, whether it's a river, stream, ocean, pond, or lake. So we influence sort of how much land area can be developed through setbacks. And it's in general 100 feet from the resource, although from streams and from the ocean it's 75 feet. And then we do have minimum lot size requirements that were alluded to, and they vary slightly depending on whether you're on the ocean or on a fresh water body. And the lot size is smaller, so you can have more dense development on the ocean than you can on freshwater bodies. And the basic rationale is that shoreline zoning provides a couple of different key public policy purposes. One is environmental protection, and so by having a little greater setback on freshwater bodies that are more vulnerable to runoff, that's why there's a larger setback and a larger minimum lot size requirement. This focuses on the area within 250 feet of these water bodies. So it's not an insignificant area. We have a lot of lakes and ponds in Maine, and obviously a lot of coastline, but it's probably a slice of the entire real estate within the state. So that's how I think we interface with what you folks are working on, is through minimum lot size requirements, whether it's lot width. We also have, in terms of frontage, lot size in terms of square footage. And a lot of this is keyed off of the number, it's based on per residential unit. So if you have to have 150 feet of frontage on the ocean, that's per dwelling.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the commissioners for Mr. Livesey? Commissioner Spalding?
Thank you, Nick. This is Heather Spalding, and I'm in the Maine room. I'm with Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, and I just was curious because a couple of the comments that we've heard in the past few meetings have, emphasized that zoning laws often hide behind, in a disingenuous way, environmental and farmland protection laws. And I just wonder what your thought is about that.
I haven't heard that charge before. And maybe that's a valid one. I think with regard to shoreline zoning, there are two basic things that are furthered by it. One is the environmental protection piece, and the other is protection of the character of our public resources. And so I'll go in reverse order. So when I'm talking about the character of a particular place, when you're talking about the ocean or a lake or a pond, those are public resources. And so they're not just for the benefit of those fortunate enough to own property fronting on them or near them. And so one of the benefits of Maine Shoreline Zoning Program is that if you go and experience some of our lakes, because of the setback requirements and the vegetation, the buffering requirements, so you can't just, not only is your camp not supposed to be closer than 100 feet if you're building new today, but there's also a requirement that you maintain, a certain amount of trees and vegetation between you and the camp and the lake. And so that benefits all users of the resource from a character perspective. And it also serves the benefit of protecting the quality of the water in the lake. The vegetated buffer, if you will, absorbs phosphorus runoff and other forms of runoff, and also provides shade along the shoreline, which benefits fish a lot and other aquatic life. A lot of that life occurs, especially at the younger phases, near the shoreline where the water is not as deep. So I think that with regard to shoreline zoning and the protection of water quality, there's pretty good science to support Maine's program. Could you achieve similar results from an environmental protection perspective with a slightly smaller setback in certain instances? You probably could, but it would also probably require more engineered and more costly measures to protect the water body. And some from a sort of public policy development perspective, I think Maine is sort of opted for the standard setback requirement, for example. And with regard to density in terms of lot size requirements and lot coverage requirements, it's really sort of applying the same basic principle. Our waters benefit from vegetation and not having a lot of impervious area right along the water bodies. And so if you limit density in one way or another, you're protecting that water quality. On the farmland part, that part I really can't speak to.
Thank you. My quick question is, what do you see as the level of compliance? What kinds of violations have you seen, and how do you enforce against those?
Sure. So with regard to shoreline zoning, there's state oversight to the program, but in Maine, home rule, we're a home rule state. And so each town has the ability, and not just the ability, they're actually required in this case to adopt their own ordinance, and they're tasked with enforcement of that ordinance. So that's left to the local code enforcement officers, and selectmen and planning boards sometimes are involved as well. And so our role is kind of twofold. We commonly assist code officers in understanding whether there is a non-compliance, and we're often sort of called upon to support them, especially when they run into local political interference, which is fairly common actually, where for whatever reason there's not a strong political desire in the community to enforce the ordinance. And then we also have the authority, which is very rarely used, to hold a town to task, I guess, if there are systematic failures within that community. As far as the range of violations that we see, probably the bulk of them relate to existing non-conforming structures. So those are sort of the grandfathered camps that are closer to the lake or closer to the ocean, and maybe unpermitted expansion of those. There's probably a fair amount of vegetation removal. That would be a common one in non-compliance with the ordinance. But I think overall, Maine has a pretty good program, and I know it's been compared to neighboring states, and when water quality in our lakes are looked at compared to others where they haven't had the same type of program, you see more algae blooms and more green lakes than you do in Maine. So I think we're lucky to have the program we have, even with its imperfections.
Thank you. I see Commissioner Pingree and Commissioner Dufour have their hands raised, but before I get to them, Commissioner Levine has joined us in the AFA committee room, and I will ask him to briefly introduce himself.
Thank you, Jeff Levine, representing Smart Growth and Planning Organizations. I apologize for being late.
Not a problem. Thank you for being here, sir. Commissioner Pingree has a question.
Great. Thank you, Nick. And if you said this already, I'm sorry, but I'm wondering if you can give us an answer to whether the statute, and it may be in the materials we just received, but whether this, how the statute speaks to minimum lot sizes not on water bodies as it relates to septic. So I think there's been suggestions to allow people to subdivide or add additional homes by right to a lot with some sort of minimum size to allow, proper septic. Obviously, it may be a very different situation if you have a public water and sewer, but I'm just wondering if you can speak to the minimum lot size required to allow septic, and how do we grapple with that, or does state law already speak to it, and is it your problem?
Well, it's not my problem, but I'll speak to it. I think the only minimum lot size requirement in statute that I'm aware of is tied to septic. So it's not it wouldn't apply to a house on public sewer. It's if they have a subsurface wastewater disposal system. And that sort of oversight of that program is actually handled by the Department of Health and Human Services. I might be wrong on this, but I believe the minimum lot size for having a subsurface wastewater disposal system is 20,000 square feet. And if I'm right about that, then that's, to put that in context, that's a little bit under a half acre. So 43,560 square feet per acre. So it's not a huge, I don't know if that's a big lot or small lot, but it's not huge, and it's tied to the subsurface wastewater disposal. Now, I'm not sure if you can get a variance from that with, a fancy engineered system. You'd have to ask somebody else. I see Judy. I think she gave me thumbs up.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Maybe she can say more.
Yeah, I did see that Judith East turned on her camera and put a thumbs up. And if you would just go ahead and introduce yourself and help answer the question that Commissioner Pingree has asked, and then I'll go to Commissioner Dufour and Commissioner Hall.
Thank you, Senator. Good afternoon, everybody. So the thumbs up was yes, the minimum lot size is 20,000 square feet for on-site septic. When you have community sewer or community water, that can be reduced. The idea is that you have sufficient size for separation between a well and a septic. So one of the ways around it, even if you don't have community sewer, is community water to reduce that lot size. Another way around it that we've looked at for Jonesport in particular, where the development pattern is extremely constrained by the old village setting, is community septic systems, not a full sewage treatment plant, but the notion of 5 or 6 lots combined to a community septic system. There's a lot of associated issues with management and maintenance and all of that, but that's another way to get smaller lot sizes.
Thank you for that. Speaker Fecto has joined us. I will ask him to introduce himself.
Good afternoon. Apologies for being a little late. I actually had the opportunity to be on a panel this afternoon to talk about all the good things that we're doing here on this commission. So a bit prematurely since we haven't drawn conclusions, but I hope I was insightful for this panel. That was a national conference. Anyway, Speaker Fecto, represent my hometown of Biddeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Commissioner Dufour has a question.
I just want to point out that words have meanings, and sometimes the way we click those or connect those words together, you send a message. And I just want to be clear, and the question to Nick is basically, if not for the work of communities and municipal officials across the state, our natural resources would be at significant risk. Is that a correct statement? That the state relies largely on local officials to protect statewide interests?
From residential development, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Hill.
Thank you. I just wanted to sort of comment on overboard discharge systems. So overboard discharge is a common practice in Harpswell. It's a highly regulated, highly sophisticated, engineered subsurface waste disposal system. When you cannot conform to conventional septic options, and they seem to be highly concentrated in my area specifically. So it is a concern. They are regulated systems, but I just wanted to ask for Nick's input on that if he had any comment, and also say that I echo the previous comment. You know, our local municipalities take great responsibility in protecting our local resources, and one of the biggest concerns in particular is erosion. So compromising density development, especially along our shoreline zone, would increase artificial seawalls and manufactured coastline, and take away from preserving, you know, the natural beauty of our state and protecting its resources. So I guess my question is, do you have any comments on overboard discharge subsurface septic systems?
I know a little bit about overboard discharges. Those are regulated through the Water Bureau, but I know enough to, I think, say a few things here. It's essential. Overboard discharges are most common. One, you can't have new overboard discharges today. So it's a weird terminology. I don't know. It's kind of a nice way of saying like a sewer pipe to the ocean. But over time, there is quite a bit of treatment that's required now. So once upon a time, there might have been a straight pipe, and that's not the case anymore. There's a lot of treatment that occurs with overboard discharges, and where we have them today, Harpswell would be an area, but coastal communities where there's a lot of ledge and small lots. So you've got no alternative, and these are licensed, and the license is renewed. I'm not sure what if it's every 5 years or how many years it is, I forget. But so that allows for ensuring that basically the latest technology is being utilized to minimize the, you know, any impact associated with overboard discharges. But we're trying to phase them out, but you can't get rid of them everywhere because we've got a lot of ledge in Maine.
Thank you, Commissioner Jackson.
Yes, thank you, Nick, for presenting that information. I did have a question about the shoreland zoning. You said that they couldn't be less stringent, but would that mean that they could be more stringent, and that certain municipalities may require further away from the body of water and therefore require more land?
Correct. There are any number of ways that shoreline zoning could be more stringent. One is you could have a bigger shoreline zone. So rather than just the 250 feet that's required, you could extend your shoreline zone 500 feet. I believe maybe Raymond or Standish, a community over around Sebago Lake has done that, is one that I'm aware of. And then certainly within the shoreline zone, you could have a larger minimum lot size requirement that we would consider that more stringent. So it's not, the dimensional requirements that we're talking about are not commonly changed, but they are. There's no question about that. Probably there, I would imagine that there are communities where the property that's sort of waterfront is in a more rural type setting, and some of those type of communities, historically they've required larger lots. So that's probably one that I would hypothesize comes up from time to time. But there's a lot of pressure for smaller lots because people who own waterfront property want to maximize the value of their property, and if they're doing that through residential development, more lots is financially desirable.
So it can be more restrictive and take up more area.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Mr. Livesay from the commission?
Oh, and I did want to quickly counter the municipalities protecting our waters. I think there are a lot of examples of municipalities that take potential revenue in lieu of and protecting our waters. I think there is some room to abuse some of these laws.
Commissioner Dufour, go ahead.
I promise I'm not going to engage in a fight, but I just want to raise the point that local governments are relied upon to advance state policy without tools most often and without the resources necessary. So I just don't want to get into a he said, she said kind of conversation where members get blamed for something when we're kind of all in this together, and we are here interested in participating in a solution, but we want to make certain that all of our interests are taken into consideration, because I will stress again, there is a lot of reliance on local government to deliver for the state. And so it's very important that when we start talking about these statewide crises, these statewide problems, that we, the municipality, will probably be one of the entities called upon to implement the solutions, but we need the support from everybody else, or you're going to set us up to fail.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the commission for Mr. Livesay? I do hope that if there are some, that we can have those before the next meeting, and then if he is required to be back to answer more of our questions or to talk to us about something that we may recommend, that he would be available for that. And with that, since Judith East has her camera on and has already introduced herself, I will move to her to talk a little bit about what she does for the Land Use Planning Commission and anything about the former state planning office.
Thank you, Senator. So by way of background on this issue, I was with SPO in 2000, 2001, so that was not a long period of time. And then for 17 years, I was executive director of the Washington County Council of Governments. So I worked with municipalities on preparation of shoreline zoning ordinances and comprehensive plans all over Washington County, and the certification and training programs for code enforcement officers as well. And I couldn't agree with Kate more that the burden of a lot of these statutes and their implementation does fall on municipalities. And it falls on them in a way that, especially for the deeply rural municipalities, can be extraordinarily difficult. They don't have the resources, they don't have the manpower, person power, or and so there may be good or bad intentions, or I don't care intentions, but there is a very real issue there. And then I would extend that also to Maine DEP. Nick did not mention that in my experience, being the person that is called upon by the towns when I was working at the regional level, the Shoreline Zoning Unit has 3 people, maybe 4 for the entire state. And so their ability to provide the backup to the municipalities is extraordinarily constrained. So it's no one's fault here, except that we have a mandate that we don't have sufficient staff to implement at local, regional, and state levels. So I needed to say that out loud in this overall context. In terms of my current position, I'm the executive director of the Land Use Planning Commission. So that is the planning and regulatory authority for the unorganized territories. Our rules are very similar to what you heard from Nick. However, we do have, we operate pursuant to Title 12 as opposed to Title 30A that governs the municipalities. And we have a set of rules for shoreline zoning, for instance, and for subdivision that is similar, guided by state statute, but unique to the unorganized territories. So there are some finer distinctions there, which I don't think I need to go into unless there's a specific question because it's a lot. It's complex. And then I guess just for purposes of sort of full disclosure and where we're going, if you're hoping for assistance from the state agency reps at future meetings, I guess I'd just like to let you know that as of November 1, I will no longer be the executive director of the Land Use Planning Commission. I will be moving to bureau director of the Bureau of Resource Information and Land Use Planning. And that bureau includes the Municipal Planning Assistance Program. And echoing what I said earlier, when I was at State Planning, I was in that division. There were 8 people, there are now 2 with no director. So the ability of the state personnel to provide the kind of technical assistance that I've seen recommended in Jeff Levine's proposal for housing assistance does not exist. And it does not exist for multiple other purposes of municipal planning assistance technical support. So I'm sorry to sort of sound like a whiner when I say these things, but there is a very real issue of capacity for technical assistance to municipalities across the board, and housing has virtually none within the Municipal Planning Assistance Program. So I just read Jeff's memo, and there's gold in there for recommendations for how to address some of the housing situation or housing issues that we have statewide. I would recommend that we get out of the shoreline zone. Actually, I don't think this issue is a shoreline zoning issue. I think this issue is a density issue. It's an infill issue. It's if there's exclusionary zoning, it's not just in the shoreline zone or because of environmental laws. It has to do with attitudes around what affordable housing means that is based on significant misperceptions about what affordability means to working people and to teachers, firemen, and so on. So I would just underscore that you've already got some really good suggestions in that memo, which I've got some experience with when I worked in Vermont with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Trust Fund and the whole area of community land trusts and how that might help with affordability. And so I think you've got some really good ideas there that I would be delighted to explore a little further. And so instead of just going on about the rules that I deal with, I thought I might just plant those seeds and leave it at that, if that's okay.
Well, thank you. It's perfectly fine. This is an organic process. And first, congratulations on your appointment to Bureau Director beginning in November. You've got big shoes to fill for sure. And I'm sure you're going to fill them quite well. Are there any questions for Ms. East from the commission before we move on? Seeing none, thank you for being here today. I will see if Mr. Allen is here now.
Yes,
Perfect.
I am. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, sir. Please introduce yourself and give us an overview of what you do and take some questions from the commission as they arise.
Certainly. My name is Michael Allen. I'm the Associate Commissioner for Tax Policy and DAFs. I think I'm here today to answer any questions you may have about municipal revenue sharing. My primary involvement in revenue sharing is through the Revenue Forecasting Commission. I am a member of the Revenue Forecasting Committee, as well as the current chair of the Revenue Forecasting Committee, and have been involved in state revenue forecasting for over 24 years. So it's through that process that a forecast of income and sales taxes is developed, and a percentage of the forecast of income and sales taxes that will go towards revenue sharing. It's the treasurer that determines how much each municipality gets on a monthly basis through revenue sharing. And I think Sam handed out to you or provided you with the Office of Fiscal and Program Review summary of how municipal revenue sharing works. And history of the dollar amounts that have been transferred into revenue sharing. So I'll end it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Speaker Fecto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Allen, for being here with us this afternoon. Really appreciate it. We had I think the reason for your invite was at an earlier meeting we had several weeks ago, a municipal leader mentioned that development, the construction of more housing leads to or has had an impact on the amount of money that a municipality receives through revenue sharing and perhaps even through the state's share of education to local municipalities. Can you provide us with some insights as it relates to that, whether or not, what's the interplay between the construction of housing and the revenue that the state provides through revenue sharing to municipalities?
Well, I think it would be through the formula itself. So, 5% of income and sales taxes for this fiscal year, it's 4.5%, but it's scheduled to go to 5% next fiscal year. But the percentage of income and sales taxes that go into the revenue sharing pot, that pot gets split 80-20. 80% goes to what we commonly refer to as revenue sharing one. And revenue sharing one is distributed to municipalities based on population and what we would call property tax effort. Basically you have full value mill rate. The higher the mill rate, the more revenue sharing that you get. So I would imagine if a town does see an influx of people because they're building, there's a lot of development going on, that would certainly increase their population, and possibly that development may create additional costs for the municipality that could increase their tax effort. On the school spending side, I would assume, again, if you have a lot of development, you may have school-age children, and that may be increasing the population of K through 12. And I believe the EPS formula would provide more funding to that municipality as their K through 12 population is increasing.
Just a quick follow-up. So would there be an easy way? I suspect not, but would there be an easy way to account for more housing, new housing being built in a municipality so that they don't get hit with a loss in revenue sharing or the state's share of education for taking the steps necessary to foster more construction in their community? I mean, I guess I would seek your perspective on the feasibility of sort of accounting for new housing being built in a community.
You're kind of getting outside of my area of expertise. I would think an increase in development would help you as far as municipal revenue sharing and school funding. I mean, I guess if the development is for, say, elderly housing, maybe that may not help you as far as your school funding goes. But how the formula could be adjusted, it's just not something that I have a lot of experience with. I think I could be helpful on at this stage.
Thank you. Commissioner Dufour.
Thank you. I think the issue that Mayor Levesque was bringing up was when you increase the amount of value in your community and nothing else changes, your mill rate could go down. And so we have formulas in place that reward, that somebody might say the poorer or higher your mill rate is, the more revenue sharing you receive. And I think what Mayor Levesque was getting at is sheltering that value. And it may not be the more appropriate route may not be an amendment to the revenue sharing formula, but maybe to TIFLA to the extent that it doesn't already allow for that sheltering. It gets back to the sheltering so that if you are making investments in whatever type of affordable housing it would be, it would protect you from those ebbs and flows of revenue sharing, or even your property taxes, your county assessment and your school assessment that are in large part based on your value, your community's wealth. So it's really sheltering. And I think TIF is probably a better place to explore a sheltering approach that will have the ultimate same impact.
Thank you, Commissioner. Hillary?
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to put on my education analyst hat for just a quick moment to touch on the funding formula, because I think there is can be a lot of confusion when we talk mill rates, because each municipality will have a local mill rate which determines the local property taxes. When you talk about the education mill rate, it is a completely separate calculation that's done on a statewide level. So that calculation is essentially the Department of Education will calculate the total cost of education based on the funding formula or the essential programs and services, or EPS is what you usually hear. They receive from Maine Revenue Service the total statewide property valuation. So this is all being calculated as the state as a whole. Then ultimately, of course, the legislature is who actually sets the budget. And based on the budget, they're determining that statewide mill rate based on how much the total cost of education is and how much money is actually being allocated by the state for the purpose. And then when it gets down to what a local, the local share, when you talk education, you're talking state share from the state, local share, which is what must be raised by the municipalities. For the local share, they're looking at whether those towns comparing what the town can pay to what that statewide mill rate is. And so those high property value towns that are able to raise their local EPS cost with a tax rate that's lower than that statewide mill rate are going to receive a smaller share of funding from the state. That amount that the education funding formula requires a local municipality to raise is going to be the amount that a municipality is going to then calculate when they're calculating their own municipal mill rate for the entire municipality. So I just wanted to make sure when we're talking mill rate, it can be very confusing because there are two things called mill rates, but they're actually very, very different calculations in terms of what a municipality is paying and what a municipality has control over. So I just wanted to jump in to make that quick clarification.
Thank you for that. Are there any questions from the commission about that clarification in particular? Thank you, Hillary. Seeing none, Commissioner Topman.
Thank you. I'm clearly out of my comfort area here in discussing revenue sharing and how it works. But I guess my question, Dr. Allen, is that the 80-20 formula that you mentioned, is there any way that you could envision a formula to be adjusted in such a way that it may reward or provide incentives to communities if they were to do something to create more housing, either more affordable housing or denser housing? I guess I'm just sort of looking for a little brainstorming here from you of things, or to be perfectly honest, if you think the formula is something that is completely untouchable and is off limits, then just say that and probably save us some trouble. Thank you.
I would never jump into whether a piece of statute is touchable or untouchable. That's beyond my pay grade. I can tell you that the municipal revenue sharing formula, while the percentage of income and sales taxes that go into revenue sharing has certainly been changed over the years by the legislature, the formula for how it gets distributed out to municipalities has been fairly stable, I would say. It's been a while, and Kate can correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't remember. It's been a while, maybe the early 2000s, since that's been played with in any significant way. I mean, there may be a way, just as Kate was saying, as far as sort of a TIF-like provision that may eliminate that additional value from being included in the revenue sharing formula and calculating the mill rate effort. I don't know. I'm not sure. I guess I'm a little confused. When we talk about development, are you talking about just housing development in general or specific types of housing development dedicated towards low-income families?
My opinion would be the latter. Others here may think the former, but our charge here is to try to, I think, increase the supply of housing. And so I think we're going to be wrestling with anything that may help contribute to that, particularly as it directly affects municipalities.
Again, I'm wading into an area that I am have limited knowledge on, and I'm going to look at Kate again. I mean, are there any property tax exemptions that apply to low-income housing? Do they fall under any of the exemptions?
Yeah,
Charitable and benevolent, or any of those?
I think they could, and perhaps, oh, I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump in. Perhaps.
No,
Go ahead,
please do.
Commissioner Dufour. It's okay.
You know, to the extent that the properties are owned by housing authorities, there may be some exemption there, but I don't know. I certainly do research for this, for the commission, but there may be avenues on that front as well. But
Well, I appreciate that Commissioner Topman is trying to always keep in mind that our charge is to determine incentives or mandates or neither, but we have to consider them. And so he's keeping us honest on that. And I appreciate that very much. Representative Arata.
Thank you. Mr. Allen, I don't think you were present for that discussion we had with Mayor Levesque, so maybe I can explain it a little bit. The issue was that Auburn has some areas where the zoning requires, I think it's like 40-acre minimum lot size, something like that. And that is artificially lowering the value of the land compared to if it were subdivided, for example, and that plays a role in the calculation of revenue sharing. So maybe you could explain that a little bit. Does that make sense?
So it's lowering the value of that land?
So, right. So the value of the land is artificially decreased because you can only build one house on, I think it was 40 acres. I could be wrong. Maybe it's 20. It's a large lot size that's required. And so the argument was that if we allow smaller lot sizes and raise the value of the property in Auburn, then we're going to get less money in revenue sharing. Can you explain that better though than I can?
Well, if the value of that land is currently artificially depressed, that's making their full value mill rate appear to be higher than it is. And so they're benefiting through the municipal revenue sharing formula because it looks like they have a much higher mill rate effort than maybe they would if that requirement wasn't there and they were able to have lower lot sizes and the value of that land was higher. So I guess that's what the point was and what the issue is.
Right.
Yeah, I think that was the conclusion based upon that reality in Auburn. Are there any other questions for Mr. Allen from the commission before we move on? Seeing none, thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you.
Is Ms. Deborah Johnson here?
I am. Hate to follow that riveting conversation about revenue sharing and very complex matter. So I'm Deborah Johnson and I am the Director of the Office of Community Development. here at the Department of Economic and Community Development. I manage the Community Development Block Grant primarily program, amongst other things. But one of the things that will, in this conversation, how I deal with your work is that my grantees that come to us for community projects, they have to do several required federal declarations, and I think that's going to go back to the fair housing, the non-discrimination, all of that. There's a series of certifications that they have to sign, the manager or town meeting or boards of selectmen, before they can get to a contract. My colleague Dan Brennan is well aware of the same issues. We collaborate and send our action plans to HUD for the programs that we administer. So just as a quick example, each community that, if I was really technical good, I could share my screen, but I can't. One example is communities have to sign a fair housing resolution, fair housing self-assessment. They have to do ADA assessments, all as a string to getting the federal dollars. So in certain cases, it makes a municipality really look at those issues. At least that's the intent. And in some cases, it's really opened the eyes of some of their restrictions or attitudes. And also, if something happens that a town that has an open existing grant with us from HUD does something that is seen as exclusionary, and it has happened, we are required to stop that grant from expending money. And it has happened before. It involved a multifamily house in a municipality regarding migrant laborers and things like that. So that's where we put in our hook. I prefer to call it the incentive to do the right thing. And we also, and Dan, you can speak to this as well, but we did do a series of public forums several years ago, and Maine Housing had a wonderful set of model land use zoning things to share with municipalities to say, hey, if you want to do this kind of work, let's give you the answers. Here's what you can do at your local level and tweak it. And I think that that's one of the things that maybe that would come out of this commission is some model land use zoning ordinances to incent communities to increase their supply of affordable housing. The other thing at our level we can do is sometimes, like, for example, we give bonus points for certain items. Like if you're in a opportunity zone, because HUD's big on opportunity zones right now. And that's another opportunity to do some affordable housing. But we can give bonus points for a municipality that is actively looking to create affordable housing. So I think that's where I come in to work with you guys. And that is along the fair housing, affordable housing. We fund a lot of co-projects with Maine Housing and the other developers all across the state. And so every community that wants to have that development, they have to come sign on to those federal certifications and do those assessments. So I think that that's sort of like the carrot to getting some funding. And I would speak to the other issue is that, and that simultaneously is this workforce housing. And that is, you've got a mill redevelopment site going on, and the company that wants to come in is going to hire X number of workers, but there's no place for them to live. So all of a sudden the municipality desires to have that housing there because they want that company to come. So there's a way to join those two items together. And I'll leave it there. Take any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Are there any questions from the commissioners? Speaker Facto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Johnson, for being here. Just to clarify, you were speaking to the incentive to do the right thing being tied to federal law, I believe. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Commissioner Brennan.
Thank you, Senator. I think Deb hit on a theme that is going to be in front of the commission as we do our work. There are many municipalities out there that are eager to do the right thing. And when we come into contact with those municipalities, we do have a bunch of tools and a bunch of best practices we can share. I think the challenge will be to try and influence other communities where there are other opportunities where we have to have more housing. Maybe it's through just not being aware, but there might be other cases where municipalities might be resistant, and how can this commission provide a framework or a set of tools for all municipalities to follow that will further the housing issue in the state. So we've heard last month or our last meeting from municipalities that get it and are doing wonderful work. And now we got to kind of push towards those communities that we have other opportunities in. So I appreciate what Deb said. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Commissioner Brennan, are there any other questions? Commissioner Spalding.
I'm sorry, but could you clarify what you were saying about the migrant workers?
I was just speaking to the federal certifications that municipalities have to sign in order to get a grant agreement from us. And that is things like fair housing assessment, fair housing declaration, all of the federal certifications that, for example, if a municipality was overtly not permitting a housing, multifamily housing project because they didn't want to have certain populations, that would fly in the face of HUD's regulations. And so they would be at risk of losing the grant from us. So that's how I say that my federal dollars, when they go to a municipality, they have to sign those federal certifications and do that work.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was an important clarification. Are there any other questions for Ms. Johnson? Commissioner Totman.
Deb, my question is, we're hearing from a sort of a theme from municipalities, I think, for asking for technical assistance and training and guidance on how they might do zoning or make enhancements to their community's efforts to promote more affordable housing. Are there any resources that come within the CDBG program that can sometimes help those counties with those technical assistance needs or those planning needs?
I think there is. I think that probably in the form of I have a set aside for state technical assistance, and it's really to help municipalities access the program. But I think the state has, in regulatory words, maximum feasible difference to do things. And if we could carve off some money to fund some of this technical assistance work, like Judy, she hit the nail on the head about resources, where, the DECD shall, and all these people shall do this thing. And then we're all looking at each other, who's going to do it, especially in this time. But yeah, I think you're exactly right, Dana, is that there's ways that I can point to the technical assistance carve off of my block grant program to do work specifically for affordable housing. And we already do that kind of stuff through my set aside with the technical assistance providers. They're not experts in zoning, but there's ways I can fund some of that work. If the resource was available, I think I could find some of the funding for that.
Commissioner Pingree.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Deb. Just as you say that though, can you just remind the commission what kind of dollars you're talking about, and generally like your overall CDBG allocation, and roughly how much of it generally goes towards funding housing projects?
Excellent point. And I was about to put the pin in the balloon of it's not a lot. So a good news is we are trending back up. My allocation annually is right now approximately $12 million. Depending on what the final budget looks like from Congress, we might be increasing this block grant. And what I have done over the last couple of years, we typically spend about, I have a huge citizen participation process. We take input from the Maine Community Development Association, public forums, municipalities, MMA, and we have sort of morphed into about a third of our money to housing, a third to economic development, and a third to infrastructure, because that's a huge need still going forward. In the 2022 draft, we're upping the housing amount and lessening maybe the economic development, because there's going to be a lot of ARPA money out there. So I think that the housing need is so huge and so great. And I'm actually, ironically, I'm at the Reno Convention annual training conference for the Council of State Community Development Agencies that I sit on the board. And that affordable housing crisis nationally is we are not speaking a different language. Everybody is facing the same issue. It's geographic, it's within your state. And I think that absolutely that everything that we can do for our funding source to increase that supply for affordable housing is probably where HUD's going with some of this, because they're certainly all about the fair housing. And somebody spoke to the fair housing rules, the affirmatively furthering fair housing. We just had a HUD presentation on that. They are getting ready to reinstitute those rules. So yeah, it's a big issue.
Thank you for that update. That's important to hear. Commissioner Jackson.
Yeah, thank you for all that information. It was really great stuff. I was wondering if since the municipalities do have to come to you to do what's right, we've heard from our previous meetings that some of the most impacted people are people of color and particularly Black people in Maine. Is there any programs or specific things that we can do to make sure that the people that are most affected by this problem actually receive those resources or those planning guiding tools?
So let me have one big caveat to that. I will say that I do the state program. So I am in the rural non-entitlement areas of the state. Portland, Biddeford, Bangor, Cumberland County, Lewiston and Auburn get their own block grant funds directly. So they do their action plans the same way I do mine for the balance of the state. And again, that's a targeted population. The block grant program is built on income levels. That's the overarching requirement, is that the target is towards 80% or below of median income. And so that's your target, regardless of ethnicity or racial makeup. So if they're targeting that lower income population, if they're happening to reach that needy population, then that's probably where they're going.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from Ms. Johnson? Enjoy the rest of your board meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here
Doesn't look like
today.
Reno, Nevada, does it?
Mr. McCarthy, are you here with us?
I am. See if we can get this going.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. So first of all, our over at DPS, State Fire Marshal's Office, we really have two pieces that deals with affordable housing and buildings in general. So you have the Fire Marshal's Office, where since 1959 we've been enforcing life safety code in all buildings that we review. Now, most people think that we review all residential buildings. We don't. We only review those buildings that actually have state or federal money in them. So projects that Mr. Brennan puts forth, anything through Maine State Housing, rural development, anything like that, we review. Other than that, it's left to the local. So that would be, echoing Kate's information as far as the local code enforcement officers take a huge brunt of enforcement of any of these things. Shoreline zoning, buildings, Mubeck is also under our shop, as well as code enforcement training. So our job is to train the code enforcement officers in 12 different disciplines, all the way from shoreline zoning to building code. And for many of these, it becomes a challenge, especially those who, we have one gentleman that he services 9 towns in Aroostook County. One code person for 9 towns makes it almost impossible to get where he needs to go. And then we ask him to get training. So that is part of what we do. So we train code enforcement officers. The enforcement is entirely at the municipal level. Towns over 4,000 are required by statute to enforce. towns under 4,000, it is an option for the town to enforce or not enforce. So you could have projects that do not get state or federal money that we don't look at. And if you go to a town that is under 4,000, you may have very little enforcement of certain regulations. So that's sort of our part of it, out of this whole sort of housing issue.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. Are there any questions from the commission? Commissioner Pouliot, Senator Pouliot.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. McCarthy, for being here today. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I'm glad that you had an opportunity to come to speak with us, because in some of our opening remarks, I actually talked about the fire marshal's office and, some of the challenges that have been posed to developers in terms of timeline. And it's my understanding, and I'm hoping you could answer for us, that there are or were recently unfilled positions within your department, which was in some cases causing delays and turnaround for approval of applications. Can you speak to your staffing levels and what might be needed, I guess? Let me put this in terms of an ideal situation for an architect or a design professional, or even a developer doing their own work, which hopefully they're not, submitting an application for approval to you to be turned around in, say, a week.
It becomes a staffing issue. So right now, I am currently still down one plan reviewer. For a majority of the summer, I had one plan reviewer to cover the entire state of Maine.
Yeah.
The issue, one of the issues is, I think, facing many businesses throughout the state, that it's hard finding people. It's not a surprise that I just saw a code enforcement position filled, paying, I think it was in the mid $90,000 range, which is a good pay range for the state of Maine. My starting pay range for a plan reviewer is $38,000.
Yeah.
It's very hard to get a person to go, do I go to the town or do I go to the state and make $60,000 less? It's very hard. So I currently have been trying to fill this one position for almost a year now. Well, I guess it's almost 16 months that we've been without this position, which puts more stress on everybody else, because I'm dragging people in to get projects moved out. So it is definitely a staffing issue.
What would you say, is the average turnaround time? And I certainly acknowledge the staffing issue. I've spoke with the governor's office about this, but I think it's important for us to all know what kind of the average turnaround time would be for a plan review currently right now. And if it's a long time, that's totally understandable. I get it. You guys are understaffed. I'm just kind of curious what that average might be.
Well, the thing is, it's very hard to do an average, because we have projects that, I have folks, I was pulling some plans off before I went on vacation. And I hate to say it, I was hitting the low hanging fruit, the ones that are quick and we can get them out of there. It all depends on the complexity of the project. Of course, if I get a small project in, I can get it out in a couple of weeks. If I have some larger projects that take more hours, we could be 8 to 12 weeks, depending on the complexity. The thing is we understand we're understaffed, and folks need to call us and go, hey, look, this is what I'm up against. I'm up against a funding issue. I'm up against this. And we'll do whatever we need to do to make sure that we're not the impediment to the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I've heard some reports, and obviously this is somewhat anecdotal, of it being that long, up to 12 weeks in some cases for the approval. And unfortunately, it's kind of like a chicken and egg thing, because a lot of times your approvals are needed in order to be able to advance to the next phase of a project and kind of keep things going along. And so what do you think it would take from a staffing perspective? Obviously, that one unfilled position needs to be filled. Perhaps we as a legislature could look at appropriating additional funds to increase the salary so that it could be more attractive to people. But what would be needed to to on a regular basis, I mean, unless somebody's giving you a Taj Mahal plan or something, to be able to like turn these around in a couple weeks?
Oh, if we were talking a couple weeks, I honestly, right now, we are in unprecedented times for number of projects coming in. So the problem is when I hire a plan reviewer, they take approximately somewhere between 6 months to a year to become effective, you know, and know everything to get them to be left on their own working. So the problem is when we brought people in, which we did bring one person in right at the height of this construction boom, and it has been a challenge. But I would say probably if I had 2 more people, I could get to the 2-week period. But of course, you know, like you said, if they bring in a really big project, it's not a 2-week turnaround.
Yeah.
But the average, if I had another 2, bringing my total in plans to 5, I think I could get 2 weeks.
Okay, that's great to know. The only other thing, I guess, on this particular topic is I've experienced myself, and again, I've only done one really kind of minor, I consider a minor development project in downtown Augusta with historic renovation. And it was a situation where I felt that the code officer was doing the best they could at the local municipal level, but then they were saying, well, that's something that has to be answered by the fire marshal. But then the fire marshal's office would say, well, that's in the purview of the code officer. And there was like a little bit of this kind of like back and forth of who should be carrying the ball. Is there any room for improvement on that front, or is that just, again, an issue of staffing?
Well, I don't think it's really an issue of staffing. I think sometimes it's a misunderstanding of what we actually do. I actually, like I said, if you were, Senator, if you were going to build a 150 unit apartment complex in Augusta, and it was privately funded, I wouldn't even look at it.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is if the code enforcement officer thinks we should look at it, and they send it to us, we're going to send it back and say, it's not us, it's you. And, you know, by statute, I really have no jurisdiction over it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think sometimes it's a communication or a misunderstanding of what a person's jurisdiction is.
Sure. Thanks.
Commissioner Pingree?
Thank you, and good to see you, Rich. I know you certainly have your hands full and are doing good work on many, many fronts. This is a question that probably you or Kate could help answer. Just try not, you know, we're grappling with housing and land use, and I'm wondering if there's sort of do code enforcement officers, I know in certain small towns, they do assist with shoreline zoning and the making sure that communities' land use policies are implemented. Is that true in every town? I know right now, I mean, you're engaged in code enforcement training. Do code enforcement officers in most communities implement all the ordinances and land use, or how many towns have greater planning staff to provide that additional assistance?
Kate, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to jump in? So I will say the vast majority, the piece that many code enforcement folks do not enforce is the building code. Most of them, it is a lot of land use, because that is one portion that they are required to do. But I still think there's a lack of understanding for many on some of the shoreline zoning issues and also land use issues, because every town is different. They all have different requirements. We were having this discussion this morning that, you know, my town is a requirement for a 1 acre lot. One of my inspectors, his town is a 2 acre lot. And to get a multifamily dwelling, it requires an acre for each additional unit. So if you wanted to build an 8-unit apartment building, so for the first 2 families is 2 acres. And then for the other 6, I would need another 6 acres. You're talking a 10-acre lot to do an 8-unit building. And it's hard for the code enforcement officers. They move town to town to kind of get that all under, we're asking them to put a ton of information and enforce huge amounts of information on them. And it is difficult. It's not an easy job. Okay, do you have more that, from the MMA side that you've heard?
The only thing I would add is that when it comes to ordinances, they're generally divided with respect to what public, what municipal official does enforcement. For the most part, all land use falls under code enforcement officers. They're the plumbing inspectors, normally the electrical inspectors. So all that land use stuff, more of the, noise ordinance enforcement goes to either the PD, so the police department. So the short answer is, to the extent that you have ordinances and they're linked to land use, it is normally the code enforcement officer that enforces them. And, to Senator Pouliot's point and Rich's point, we are having a tremendous difficulty hiring code enforcement officers. I mean, they are basically becoming unicorns. You cannot find them. And so there are pressures there, and training and education is definitely one. And I think, Rich's department has one person dedicated to educating and training code enforcement officers across the state on some pretty complex issues. So it gets back to one of the underlying or the common themes we hear is resources, investment in technical assistance and education for those who are relied upon to provide the services.
Commissioner Pingree?
I don't want to put Rich on the spot, but the anecdote he provided about that town is kind of what we're thinking about and debating. I'm wondering, can you tell us what town that is? Because I think one of the sort of challenges of information is there isn't actually a spreadsheet of every town. What is the minimum lot size? What are the requirements? I mean, obviously every town has multiple districts, et cetera, but you don't have to answer that question. I'm just wondering if you could tell us.
Actually, I believe it is in, and I'm not sure if the property, the inspector lives, I believe he lives in Windsor, if my memory is correct. And, but he does own he actually owns rental properties in a couple of towns, so it may have been one of those, but it's in the central Maine area.
Senator Pouliot?
So I think we've touched upon something I think that I hope that this commission underscores is something that we do have the ability to change, which is funding and for within the DPS and particularly the fire marshal's office to help with that in particular, and also potentially some grants for local municipalities to help with code officers, because there are developers who will find the resources to put together projects. They've got the right design professionals. They can kind of, for lack of a better terminology, lawyer up to get all this stuff done and have a DP handle it and hand over a project that's done. But when you start talking about smaller mom and pop, maybe contractor, husband and wife team or something that wants to do a project in a community, and I've seen some of these folks, even just a small scale, is trying to redevelop some of these old buildings in downtown Augusta, and they don't really have the bandwidth to go through a historic tax credit renovation. So they're just trying to bootstrap it and pay cash. And they get stuck in this quagmire of approvals and dealing with codes and stuff. And they don't do it every day because they're not an architect or an engineer, and they just get frustrated and they throw their hands up. And so to the extent that we can figure out ways, and this isn't a criticism at all, it's just the way that the system is set up, to the extent that we can find ways to help improve that process, I think we stand a better chance of of allowing some of these smaller infill projects that aren't going to move the needle per se tremendously, but they could help. You know, I know of one building owner just in downtown Augusta, for instance, that was going to do a project that would have added like 5 units, and they just got kind of burnt out by the process of dealing with codes and so forth. And granted, they're probably you know, a frustrated Mainer that's just like, you know, I don't like to be told what to do, and heck with all these codes. That certainly is probably some of it, but also, you know, they had their process before the fire marshals, their plan before the fire marshal's office for 12 weeks. And they're like, this is just taking way too long. I'm going in this other direction. We're just not going to do them down there anymore. So, you know, I think that really what it comes down to is in part staffing, but also what can we do to kind of improve the process so that code enforcement officers understand that they are empowered to do this. They're the decision maker and can make this decision at the local level, and then give them the tools and resources to be able to do that. I think we'd see some more success.
Thank you, Senator. And just for everyone on the commission and those listening, this commission will report back to the legislature, and under the constitutional authority granted to the legislature, we can do anything we want. So we can be bold, and it doesn't have to be anything that we think we're going to get the votes on. We can certainly make recommendations that just take all of this into consideration, and we will obviously talk more about the process whereby we will come up with that report. But I do want people to understand who are listening that this is a commission that will make a report, and it will include recommendations that the legislature will either adopt or not. So we can certainly think outside of the box on everything. And as we keep ingesting all of this information, you know, we'll have 2 weeks before we come back again and further our discussions for all of us to put on our most creative hats, and take what we think is best to solve this problem. And we will debate it, we will discuss it, we will flesh it out, and we will vote on it, and we will bring that back to the legislature for review. Are there any other questions for Mr. McCarthy from the commission at this time? Seeing none, thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you.
It is 3:15. I do believe that it is probably time to move into our public comment portion of the day's agenda. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Perfect. So I knew someone asked earlier about when we get there, and that person has left the attendee online. Is there anyone that's present in the room that would like to provide any public comment to the commission? Raise your hand if so. Seeing no hands raised. And so I'm going to go to the attendees online, and I see that Christina Egan has her hand raised. So I'm going to promote you to a panelist, and you will come into our space. And you can provide public testimony for up to 4 minutes. We will not run a clock, but I'll certainly keep my eye on it. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Senator Hickman, and hello, Speaker Fecto and members of the Commission. I'm Christina Egan. I'm the Director of the Greater Portland Council of Governments. And in our region, we have recognized that housing is a really serious problem. And I'm sure you've heard lots of testimony in the past about what that problem is. So I won't repeat it. I'll just say one little data point that caught my eye like recently was that in Cumberland County, 65% of homes have sold for over asking this year. So that is quite a different kind of housing market than we had before, which was already tight. So we need more affordable housing. We need more supply. I see those as two different strategies. One requires public subsidy in order for us to make sure that we have affordability, but the other allows for the market to perform where it needs to. And if we can remove the barriers there, then we're able to increase the supply of housing overall, which will have a depressive effect on housing prices. Our members, which are municipalities, care a lot about housing. And for 7 of our municipalities, which are organized in something we call the Metro Region Coalition, which includes Portland and the 6 surrounding communities, they have set a goal of expanding the supply and the diversity of housing by 10% by the year 2025. And this is specifically for low and middle income households. We have recognized as a region that municipalities have an important leadership role to take in improving the amount of housing choices that are out there. And in recognition of doing that, we commissioned a report, which I believe you're familiar with, which Jeff Levine, one of your commissioners, did for us, which actually outlines what are some of the zoning barriers in our area and what that's resulted in. And the real takeaway there is that about 4% of our land is available for multifamily housing development, which is a very small percentage. And it's just another indicator of the shortage that we're seeing. We looked at why we have such a small amount of land that allows for multifamily housing. And there are a lot of different barriers, ranging from ones that I know that you've spoken about at the commission. The required lot sizes may be too big. There may be parking standards and requirements. Permitting processes are uncertain in some ways for developers, or they're too cumbersome. And there are many, many more. And I won't go through all of them right now, but I do want to say that it's important not only that we increase the amount of housing, it's also important where that housing goes. And this is important from a taxpayer perspective. So municipalities rely primarily on property taxes. And in order for us to provide the infrastructure that's needed, we need to be able to do it in places that make sense, where people are already living, working, playing, where there is sewer and water, if there is such a thing in that area, roads, schools, et cetera, to be more clustered so that we don't have to spend as much money maintaining far-flung infrastructure. This is also important for state dollars, which also have play a big role in maintaining and building the infrastructure that we need in a region. And then from a climate perspective, it's also important that we locate housing in places that make sense in order to reduce commutes, which we all know transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gases in the state, and also to reduce sprawl and preserve the places that make Maine so special. So we have several recommendations for the commission. We did provide some testimony, and I just want to outline them for you right now. Number one, it's important for municipalities to designate an area for the growth and a place that reinforces our main villages, our downtowns, and our crossroads. So once we do that, it's important to have the housing goals be very well defined. And we would look to the state and this commission to help us define what those housing goals are. Now, we did do it in the region for our 7 municipalities. And I'll just share with you the numbers on that. So in 2019, which is our baseline, we have about 65,000 units in our region. So in order for us to expand it by 10%, that would be about 6,500 more units by 2025. We did do a follow-up progress report in 2020, and what we were able to achieve was 350 units. So that's only 5% of our goal, and we're only a few years away from our target in 2025. So I illustrate this to say that municipalities like Dan Brennan said before, that really want to do the right thing, they're still having trouble meeting those goals. And there's some reasons for that. And the first is that we don't have adequate resources. And I was only able to tune into a part of the commission meeting before, but I heard you're talking about revenue sharing, about other ways of trying to provide resources. The resources are extremely thin for municipalities to be able to take a look at their zoning, do an audit of it, figure out how to change the zoning in order to welcome more housing. So technical assistance is really important. And I know MMA has emphasized this as well. It is hard for municipalities to make progress on these very important issues without resources to do so. And so the second piece of what I recommend is that we think, or you think at the commission level, what are those funding sources that would be available that would be robust enough to help municipalities that across the board, from rural to urban, be able to zone to allow for more housing? The third part of what I'm outlining for kind of a framework for thinking about this is that there need to be incentives, financial incentives on top of technical assistance resources to do this money. And those technical assistance resources will help us figure out what the menu of options are, the flexible, the different kinds of tools that will fit for different communities. But in terms of getting the incentives, we need incentives both to get the ordinance changes in place that will welcome the housing. And then once those housing goals are realized and housing is actually produced, another layer of reward for municipalities. So I will stop there. This commission has so much great influence over the future of our housing market. I don't envy the job as you try to synthesize all of the different stakeholders and the different competing demands on the resources that we have at the state level. But I do believe that if you do something bold, like Senator Hickman said, and really look at the structure of how our taxation is set up, the way our resources are aligned, and helping municipalities do the right thing in order to improve more housing choices in the state, we will be all much better off. Now, happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. Speaker Fecto has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Ms. Egan, for being with us this afternoon. First, going to opine, and then I have a question that will follow. One of the things that makes me a little bit nervous as it relates to the work that's before us and how we are going to set out to solve the challenges that exist with building affordable housing is we know that when change is proposed at the local level, the people who wish to see the status quo protected are usually the loudest, and they usually show up. And those who stand to gain from change are not present at meetings, in some cases because they might not even be a resident of that community yet. For example, we've seen the Cape Elizabeth situation regarding a proposed multi-unit development there in the news as of late. It's been probably the most prominent fixture in the news around this very topic. And one of the arguments being used is that low-income people don't live in Cape Elizabeth. Therefore, we don't need this kind of housing in Cape Elizabeth. Well, it might be true that there are very few people in Cape Elizabeth who are by definition low income, but there are certainly low to middle income individuals working in Cape Elizabeth at restaurants, at bars, at the attractions that bring tourists out year after year to the beautiful sites in Cape Elizabeth. And so while they may not be residents at this time, they certainly would stand to gain from affordable housing or multi-unit construction in a town like Cape Elizabeth. But they're not present at a town meeting, those who stand to gain from that kind of project. So I guess I would be curious to hear your perspective on how do we break through this challenge where the people who show up, they are successful in keeping the status quo, which is to not permit change like density or like getting rid of single family zoning and so forth. How do we do that?
No, Speaker Fecto, you're putting your finger right on such a big problem in our region, and I appreciate it. And I used to be a town councilor in Freeport, and so I was sitting at those benches with folks that came out from my district that may protest against some new development that could have a larger public benefit. Neighbors have a hard time understanding change, and we all know that's true in our municipalities. Is people love the quality of life that they have right now, and they fear that new housing development in particular could change that or threaten that. So I think there's a two-prong answer. It's a complicated dynamic to really overcome. And the first is obviously education and doing a better job talking about why we need housing, why we need it in places that make sense, why we can design it in ways that fit into the context. I think a lot of people have a big idea of a huge apartment building being located next to their beautiful single family house that has a large yard. And yet there are many ways that you can create housing that looks like it belongs and feels good to the community and can really allay people's fears a lot with visuals. That's a bigger issue that needs to be done throughout Maine to help our residents understand why housing is a good thing and that they should be welcoming it. But the second thing goes back to my testimony in this kind of three-prong strategy to identify the growth areas, do that through a community-based process. We have the comp planning processes and others to be able to do that, bring the community along so they know where the growth is going to go. And the second is to provide technical assistance so we know that the growth can be desirable. It can look great. And the last piece is that counselors, when I was sitting on the Freeport Council, will respond if there's money hanging out there for doing the right thing. It makes it easier, I'll speak bluntly, it makes it easier to take that hard vote. If you know that there is a taxpayer benefit, that the city or town is going to get rewarded for the housing that gets produced. And I think that's a good countervailing way to deal with those loudest voices that do tend to show up in the town hall space.
Thank you.
And to follow up on that, thank you very much for those answers. Did you have a question, Commissioner Spalding? We're talking about resources a lot. Can you tell me how much money we're talking about, please?
Well, I have not done that estimate. I will say that we have communities in our region that range from very well resourced planning departments, like the city of Portland, that can do this very well, to communities that are 3,000 or 4,000 people that don't have planners, don't have the technical expertise to do this. I am a big believer in regional approaches, which is why I'm at the Greater Portland Council of Governments. We can provide regional technical assistance in ways that's a lot more efficient. So for example, Vanessa Farr, who is one of our senior planners, is going to be doing the comprehensive plan for Casco. We work with Long Island to help them on certain elements of their planning. We provide technical assistance on different things. And when you could work through the regional planning agencies, you can get a bigger bang for the buck in many ways. So if you're going to press me on actual money, I'll give you an estimate. We just did a plan for the downtown of Saco and Biddeford, looking at ways to enhance transit and transportation access for the Mill District, which has some of the largest number of new units coming online in Maine. And that plan cost us about $60,000 in order to do the public engagement, work with both city councils, figure out what the infrastructure costs would be for it. So those are the types of things that need to happen. You know, I heard before that there's I believe it from one of your commissioners that the resources are very thin in the CDBG program and the Community Development Block Grant Program. There really is no place for an agency like ours or for municipalities to go and apply for housing technical assistance money. It's part of our job to do it, but there's really no funding to do it. And the state resources for planning in general are extremely thin. And I think there's a missed opportunity there, because you can work directly with municipalities to help them do it. You can also work through entities like ours that have the reach and the relationships to be able to manage projects with our partner municipalities.
I appreciate that. I think that my request then would be, you know, and we only have 2 meetings left, clearly, and the work won't end with the 2 meetings because this moves on to the legislative process. But I think that for anyone listening, we're going to have to know a utopia amount of money that could fall from the sky that would provide no more excuses for thin resources in all of these different areas where we are finding that we don't have them. I don't know what that number is. Is it $1 billion? What is it? I want to know. And I want all of the folks that are listening to come up with a number that is utopia and provide it to this commission for deliberation, because it's really hard to solve a problem based upon lack of resources when we don't know what it would cost to not have a lack of resources.
Thank you for that, Senator. Can I say one last thing about resources?
You may.
Yeah, so I gave you the $60,000 for a plan of a fairly large district. And a couple other numbers, we're doing some work to do a zoning audit in Gray right now. That's costing about $8,000. So you can really run the gamut. I would say for a relatively modest amount of money, if you were to work through the regional planning agencies, I would like some time to think about this, but I am going to give you a number because it sounds like you're desperate for numbers. I'd say if you were doing something around the $200,000 a year level per region, you could get a lot of great planning work done, a lot. And if it were focused on housing, you could probably scale that back a little bit. If you wanted to build in climate resilience, you could scale it up. But you know, the approach that regional planning agencies and others take is to take a look at where's the broadband going to go? Where's the transportation plan? Where's public transportation? Where's housing? Where's the open space? How do we get all of these things to connect and create beautiful places that reinforce what Maine is all about? And to do that well, we need resources. And to do that well, we will also, if we do it well, I mean, we will also be able to have those climate impacts and those equity impacts that I think we're all seeking to use state resources for those outcomes.
Thank you very much for taking my bait. I appreciate it. Senator Pouliot.
Welcome anytime.
Well, I just have to say, as a fiscal conservative, I'm really intrigued by Ms. Egan's assertion that we can move the needle for 200 grand per region. So, man, I wish that everybody, I'm sure Representative Arata wishes that everybody that came before the Appropriations Committee would say that they can move the needle in a drastic way for 200 grand. So,
and Senator, I mean per year. I don't mean just a one time, right? It's an ongoing process.
That's no problem. I'll find that out of 8.5 billion. But in all seriousness, I think what you've suggested is really good. I mean, for instance, just recently was at a planning board meeting in a local municipality talking about siting of solar. And we at the state level passed a really significant policy in net metering. And now there's this proliferation of solar arrays going up around the state, which I was a co-sponsor of the bill. I'm certainly in favor of more renewable energy. However, that's eating up some land that could potentially be utilized as, you know, as development land and housing for affordable housing. But the local, you know, municipality just didn't really have the bandwidth to dig down and say, perhaps it's best that we look at these specific areas because of ABC as to where we might want to consider, you know, solar being sited in our community and what's a logical cap. We at the state just passed a level, and then the capitalistic free market economy did what it does best and started looking at ways to get these things approved. And now we're starting to see a lot of land that might be more suitable for other purposes, be it agriculture or housing, being, you know, now taken off the market, if you will, for the next 20 years. So it sounds like your agencies could, if provided resources, help municipalities with something like that, for instance. Like, where would this be appropriately cited?
That's right. And, you know, the other answer to, I think, Speaker Fecto's question about public support for housing is exactly that, Senator Puyo, which is that when you plan for housing, you can also plan for where you're going to save your natural resources, whether it be agriculture or other kinds of natural resources. And the two really should go together when you're planning. And when you go to, say, a town meeting, or you go before a council and you have a plan for saying, hey, we're going to shape growth and kind of funnel it into places that are already served by infrastructure, good for taxpayers, good for walkability, good for quality of life. And at the same time, we're going to be really intentional about saving these other places that are beautiful natural areas that, you know, have lots of different kind of values recreationally and ecologically. Those two things should go together. And when you present them together, it's a lot easier for a municipality's residents to accept the housing because the growth is tempered with preservation, which all residents want.
Thank you for that, Ms. Egan. Do the councils of governments talk to each other?
We do. We have a little association that we talk amongst ourselves. A lot of us are actually economic development districts. GPCOG is a little bit of a different beast than others because we do the transportation planning under federal statute. We distribute transportation funds. And we do the economic development. The regional planning organizations in Maine used to have a much bigger role in planning, but the funding has been scaled back significantly in the last 12 years or so. So the planning functions have I don't want to use the word eviscerated, but they were very, very thin at this point. So, so my colleagues around the state, like us, get, you know, $10,000, $15,000 a year to do the planning work.
So is it possible then to request that at maybe another meeting in the future of the associations of councils of government that you all could, on behalf of this commission, put together a budget for what it would look like for these different economic regional groups? What would be the best number? Are you giving us one? I'm appreciative of that, but I'm wondering if all of the other ones agree with you, or do they need more or less, depending upon what they're dealing with in their regions?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to do that work, and I'll reach out to my colleagues and we'll provide something for you.
Thank you. Commissioner Dufour has a question.
I think Commissioner Arata or Representative Arata is ahead of me.
Oh, yes, you are correct. Thank you for that catch. Representative Arata.
Thank you. No offense. I was wondering if it's appropriate or reasonable, looking at money that already exists, such as grants for municipal water systems. Would it be appropriate to tie the criteria for those grants to our goals to increase the housing supply, maybe by increasing density, which, you know, of people who use the water system, so there'd be more rate payers. Is that something that is reasonable, appropriate?
So Representative, Should I answer that?
Sure.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, it's a great question, Representative, and it begs a larger question about whether you tie existing state money to municipal performance on housing versus additional money, right? And that's a policy question that this commission would need to wrestle with. I'll say that one of the things that was created under Republican Governor Mitt Romney in Massachusetts is something called Commonwealth Capital. And in that program, what they did is they looked at the suite of kind of municipal grant programs and awarded those programs to municipalities based on a point system. Did you have a growth area? Were you making progress on affordability? Were you preserving land? What were you doing on clean water? So a lot of the things that the state set as goals became criteria that were factored into whether grants were awarded or not to municipalities. You know, that's one approach. In addition, there was technical assistance money that was new that came from the legislature to complement that and allow kind of lower resourced municipalities the ability to take those actions so that they were competitive for grants, because that's also an issue with smaller rural areas. They're not going to be able to perform well in certain areas. So I can't comment on the specific water program that you're talking about, but I think there's a larger policy question that you will need to grapple with. And it might be at both ends. There may be some programs that make a lot of sense to tie to housing performance in some ways, and also some additional money that would incent municipalities to be able to make those changes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I just did a quick Google search and found 10 grants. And so, you know, just for municipal water. So that's maybe a source of funding. I don't know, but thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Commissioner Dufour.
Thank you. Ms. Egan, thank you for the presentation as well as the memo you prepared. And this is not necessarily a question, so I'll use the legislative, you know, don't you think kind of approach. But I agree with your points. I mean, we have an internal group at MMA of municipal officials that are grappling with with the housing effort, and they agree 100% with what you're saying. Options and flexibility. We get it. There is a problem out there. We need to address it. We need to change. We need to move the needle. And, you know, despite my, you know, mama bear approach, I get that. Our members get that. Change is absolutely necessary. We need to move forward. We need to address our zoning ordinances, but we need flexibility. We need options, because one solution that works in Presque Isle might not work in Portland or anywhere else. So I appreciate that flexibility component of it. I also appreciate the resource element of it. And I agree that there is a regional solution here. And I think councils of governments and planning commissions across the state could play a significant role, because you are trusted in the municipal community. So I think that's spot on as well. And the last I would add, which is not necessarily reflected in your proposal, would be an assessment of the goals, you know, throughout time, to make certain that we are actually meeting the goal, that it's working, and to the extent it's not, a reassessment and a redirection. Because if we don't have that assessment, we get to a point where we've invested all this time, all this energy, and we haven't achieved the end goal, where maybe with just an assessment and a slight tweak, we could actually get there. So I think that's also an important element of a package. And I guess I can do it. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree with everything you just said, Kate. And, you know, I do want to underline this flexibility point that you made, because I have it in my written testimony, but I didn't say much about it in my oral. But it's very important to understand that how different the municipalities are within Maine, and that there are, you know, the last presentation I gave to the city and town managers in Maine, we had 12 different zoning barriers to look at that needed to be addressed in different ways. And municipalities can layer these zoning things that seem to make sense at the moment on top of one another. And so to delayer them, you need to really do an audit, understand them, and then make the tweaks that are going to make sense within the community's context and also within the community's existing ordinances. So it is important to understand this is complicated work. And it's also work that really needs to be tailored to the different municipalities because we're a home rule state. So Kate, thank you for bringing that up. I wholeheartedly agree.
Commissioner Pingree.
Thank you, and I'll try not to belabor it because we've had this guest on for a long time, but it's good to see you, Christina, and thank you for coming. I just want to point out something, and I think Christina probably has more expertise, but I will say with the defunding of many of the regional planning groups from the state level, there are some regions of the state that don't have any regional planning programs. So I think, you know, GPCOG has a very robust program, has been extremely entrepreneurial. Other parts of the state have sort of moderately funded groups, and there are some parts of the state that have zero. I happen to live in one of those regions that no longer has planning commission support. So I think that the piecemeal nature of it does speak to how do you rebuild? I mean, I think the question for Christina is, do you agree with that? But no, I would also say I haven't seen your memo, and maybe it's in our email, but I would, I think the whole point on incentives, and I think that Representative Arata sort of started to speak to, you know, there are grant programs we could tie this to. There have been people who've started to talk about different transportation funding programs, which, you know, you can see the link between more dense housing and transportation. I mean, I think we've been contemplating this concept of incentives for how do we encourage some of the land use policy. We either use the big stick, or are there some incentives the state can provide tied to other things in which we spend money that would encourage the kind of denser housing development, more workforce and affordable housing across our state. So I don't know, Christina, if you have specific ideas or happy to receive them, you know, after you've thought about it as well.
Yes, I mean, and to your first point, there is very uneven capacity throughout the state for regional approaches. And so anything that the commission puts together to provide technical assistance to municipalities will have to have some flexibility itself and allow for direct grants to go directly to municipalities or other regional organizations that may not be quasi-governmental like councils of government are. And to your second point about the trying to look at grant programs that the state already has, like I really encourage an integrated approach, and municipalities are always desperate for transportation dollars, for example. And when we invest in our region, we've taken action to invest in our limited transportation dollars. We get a federal allocation and a transit allocation every year in certain places that we know are ripe for growth or are growing or are already robust centers of activity. And we have these priority centers. We have about 26 of them or so in our region, and we try to prioritize our transportation funding for those places. If you can complement that with zoning technical assistance so that there is more housing that's produced in those places, then you're saving transportation dollars at the same time as reaching your housing goals. And the same could be had about broadband. It's a more complicated conversation, but when you are looking at transportation, broadband, housing, and economic development together, that's when you're going to get the kind of outcomes that you're looking for in terms of housing production, but also in terms of climate and social equity and racial equity.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Ms. Egan from the commission? We appreciate your insight, and we look forward to what else you bring to the table for us. And we do have your memo in our email, I do believe, and it will be also on the commission's website.
I very much appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for allowing me to have a dialogue with you.
Absolutely. Is there anyone else who is present in the attendee space who would like to give public comment today? Mr. Rio, 1 second, and I will promote you to panelist. Can you hear? There you are.
Yes, thank you. So George Rowe from West Bayside. I was not able to attend the last meeting, although I did watch it, and I commend you on an excellent effort there to try and, I mean, the video alone that you are creating from this effort is worth a great deal. What I'm concerned about, of course, is, your recommendations, because you guys have attempted to get your arms around an enormous sprawling issue, is, where do you start? And of course, after my remarks now, you're going to try and figure out a way through to some kind of final resolution here. But I want to just make it clear that, the status quo is what you are up against. I don't want to be patronizing. I think you all know that. But, organizations like the Affordable Housing Lobby, GPCOG, the planning establishment, I mean, these are all groups that are just so invested, and I've said it before, so invested in, wanting things to continue mostly as they are, because they're so used to that system. And they've been able to, they've invested, frankly, a lot of time in creating it, that they're really only interested in tweaks. And if we want to solve the problem, I mean, the future of Maine is on the line. Housing infects everything. And, we have nursing homes closing. We have, businesses that can't hire. We have governments that can't hire. We have work that is there on the table that can't get done. Why? Because towns that have been given this home rule benefit have abused it on the level of, I mean, I can't even imagine. I mean, GPCOG is the last group you want to be hearing from.
Mr. Reel, may I please ask you a question?
Sure.
What solutions do you have to offer this commission? Because I don't want to go down a road where there's only criticism without offering solutions. And we have asked you as a commission to provide for us a couple of different places for us to look for solutions that you think may satisfy a move beyond the status quo. And so I'm going to give you 1 minute to say nothing negative about anyone or anything or any entity. I want you to only offer solutions. You have 1 minute.
Maine needs a Massachusetts type 40B program on steroids. And the basis for that should come directly from, for example, the Desegregate Connecticut group that was formed in the last few years, that goes to the heart of the affluent, basically, greedy white people, towns that have created a land use regime that only operates for their benefit and their benefit only. That 40B, and again, that's the name of the law in Massachusetts, that 40B will assign and allocate, and California is doing something similar, distinct goals for every community in the state based on some somewhat objective metrics. But that will tell every single town in Maine what is expected of them over the next 5 to 10 years, and there will be penalties. And if you're not willing to create that kind of program, then there is nothing other than symbolism and posturing. There is nothing that this commission will offer the state that will do anything but reinforce the status quo and probably continue to make Maine basically a retirement home for wealthy people. And the rest of us will be lucky enough just to be their servants and their groundskeepers.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the commission for Mr. Rose?
If you can get that, you would be getting a long way through. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, sir. Are there any more people who are attending who would like to provide public comment? Please raise your hand. Seeing none, we will close the public comment for this commission meeting. And with that, we have one more agenda item, which is a discussion of next steps. And Hillary will step back up for that, but on that, I'm going to turn directly to Speaker Fecto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to Commissioner Levine, first and foremost, for sort of taking the ball and running. I think providing us with a really helpful memo that starts to get our minds thinking about what solutions could look like, or what the recommendations that might be included in a final report from this commission might look like. I think there's a couple of things that we could do as we proceed. We have 3 meetings technically left, but I think we're down to 2. We're down to 2 meetings. So I think it's most likely that our next meeting would really be a deep dive into what we would want to see as recommendations to the full legislature in a final report. And then our final meeting, which I believe is scheduled for 3 weeks following our next meeting, to give our wonderful staff the time to actually produce the report. And that would be an opportunity for us to review it and make any final edits and ultimately take a vote. So I wonder if it might be helpful for us to all do a little homework and
a lot of homework.
and maybe not necessarily with the same level of detail as Commissioner Levine, but at least come to our next meeting with some of our own ideas of what we think we want to see. What do we want to see included in that final report as a recommendation to the full legislature, as something that can be changed. I think that would probably be a helpful starting point for all of us to launch into conversation next week and make some final decisions. So I guess I would put that out there for the commission to discuss. I don't know if I hope that we at this point have all had a good taste of what other states and what other places have done around this topic. And I think if there wasn't enough of that, there could potentially be one more resource for us, maybe that could be provided to us as reading material between now and next week, from Up for Growth, which is a national organization. But if folks feel like if they've received enough information at this point, I think we probably are at a point where we have ideas as to what we want to see done.
Thank you, Speaker Fecto. Any comments from the commission on that suggestion? You know, I'll just say that I do think it's a great idea for now. All of us, we're all appointed for our expertise in the fields that we represent. And so I would offer that we get territorial now and we bring back recommendations that we believe are going to help solve the problem, but may also bring our constituencies to the table that we represent in the real world. And so when you have a commission that is outside of the legislature, and there's a lot of folks here who are not in the legislature, we want you to make sure that the reason your presence was noted so that you got the appointment is a part of what you bring to the table, as Commissioner Levine has done. Representative Arata.
Thank you, Senator Hickman, and you've done a fantastic job. I just wanted to tell you that. Would you like us to write up our suggestions and send them to Sam to compile, and then we would get to see each other's suggestions ahead of time?
If people are willing and able to have their suggestions written up ahead of time, that is the assignment. And I think that's a great idea. The same way we've gotten Commissioner Levine's ahead of time, it will give all of us an opportunity. And it's okay if we're redundant, that will be fine. I do think, though, that we should think outside of the box to the extent that we force ourselves to do that. So yes,
Okay,
Representative
thank you.
Arata, that's a great idea. Anyone else? Hillary?
So I think and I looked to Senator Hickman and Speaker Fecto, but we had been tentatively planning for next Thursday, October 7th. I think I have that date right.
Yeah.
So if anyone does want to send us your recommendations, if we get that, by maybe end of day, Tuesday, the 5th, we can compile that into one document and send that out so that everybody can see what everybody else is thinking. Certainly, that doesn't mean you can't come to the meeting with more recommendations, but if we do get that by you, we'll try to put that together to use that as a reference. We also provided a couple additional materials for you, sort of starting when you start thinking about recommendations that I just want to highlight that you have.
Thank you.
One of those is actually in the selected statutory excerpts document that my colleague Sam Prower handed out in the very, very beginning of this meeting. There is a link.
Do you know what color that is?
Sure, it's blue.
Thank you. We'll go for blue.
The first page says state level laws that impact zoning and land use.
Yep.
Maine. If you go to page 5, although it's page 1 because it's the selected statutory, page 1 of the selected statutory excerpts. At the bottom of that page, and I can send this link out to everyone separately so you don't have to go digging for it, but there is a link there through Maine law that has ordinances from all over the state. And so I know Commissioner Pingree had mentioned earlier, wouldn't it be nice if we had a spreadsheet? We don't have a spreadsheet, but that is a link that if you know of a town whose ordinances you think are helpful, or you just want to peruse to see what some of these ordinances look like, that's a valuable resource. And if there's anything in particular you think would be helpful or is relevant to a recommendation that you want to make, feel free to let us know and we can try to make sure there's a copy of that for the next meeting.
Thank you for that. Oh, that one. Yeah, there it is.
But yes, I can send that out, link out
I
separately
said,
so you're not digging
the
for
speaker had
it.
to say Hickman, like turn the page. Okay, there it is.
The other thing we put together, and this was actually a request of Commissioner Pingree earlier in the commission's work, is a list of a lot of these bills that the legislature has looked at during the 130th regarding affordable housing provisions. And that is, for those in the room, it's a pink sheet. For those at home, it's 2 separate documents, I believe. One is all the affordable housing provision bills that have been carried over to the second regular session, as well as their committee of reference and the status disposition, whether it was carried over in the committee of reference or whether it was carried over on the special appropriations table.
Thank you.
On the back of that, if it's pink or on a separate document, is also just sort of a big list of all of the various bills that were introduced during the first regular session. Some of these include those that have been carried over, but also includes those that were ought not to pass or were that ultimately enacted. One that is actually not on here, which it should be, relates, Senator Hickman, to one of your questions earlier, and I want to thank Deirdre for sending this to me. But you had asked about Representative Talbot Ross's bill about fair housing, which I think may have been what Andy O'Brien was referencing. That is not on this list, but should be, and I'll get it added. But that was a bill that requires the Maine State Housing Authority, to the extent consistent with federal law, to ensure that Maine State housing funding or any state and local funding is used in a manner that will affirmatively further fair housing in the state. And I'm sure Director Brennan is probably aware that there's a report back related to that bill to the Labor and Housing Committee in January of next year, which may dovetail with some of the things that we've talked about in this commission as well. You will not find that law in your statutory excerpts, and that is because that law did not have an emergency preamble and has not gone into effect yet. Technically does not go in effect till October 18th, but I can send the text of that law out to you as well so you are aware of it.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Topman?
Thank you, Senator. I have a comment and a question. I really want to applaud Commissioner Levine's memo. I think the balance that he provided in both incentives and mandates and technical assistance just sort of covers the threads and the themes that we've been hearing throughout our deliberations. And so I guess my suggestion is if Commissioner Levine could expand any of these and take them to another step, I would find those particularly helpful and certainly hope that none of us would think that he's made his suggestions and we can hear no more from him, because I think they were on the money and would encourage him to flush them out even more, because I think they're really, really helpful. The question I have is a sort of a technical one, maybe it's technical or I'm not sure, but we've got, I think in Jeff's recommendations, there's a discussion about the ADUs, and I've heard conflicting stories that there was an ADU legislation that was defeated last session, and I've heard it was carried over. And so I guess my question is, and maybe it's there's no easy answer, but is the idea of having ADUs more statewide open, or was that something that was considered and defeated and it's sort of off the table for us to be considering as a recommendation?
I believe it's on the appropriations table. I could be wrong about that. Speaker Fecto?
Yeah, it has a very small fiscal note that did not get funded off the table.
And then what is the LD on that?
1312.
That's the correct. That was, I know exactly all about that now. It's coming back to me in floods. Yeah, that bill is on the appropriations table, and we certainly, with our work here, can revisit that issue as we have seen. You know, I want to thank the staff for this excellent research, this compilation of state law, the summary of the court cases. I mean, I love reading, and a week, I almost feel like we should have another week until our next meeting, but I also know that we're going to need that 3 weeks to really get everything together. And so that being said, I want to make sure that we all, if people do not bring us any more ideas because they believe that there's a strong basis from what Commissioner Levine has put forth, that's great. But I do want to encourage people still to bring us their recommendations from their point of view as well. And that will give us an opportunity to look at what we believe as a commission are the best recommendations to the legislature. And then we'll have 3 weeks to revisit, flesh out all of that. I want the file, the record for this commission to be complete as it is, this is awesome. And I want to make sure that we leave no stone unturned. And so there are some recommendations that we heard last week that I hope folks will consider bringing forward. I'm not going to promise that I'm going to have anything as chair of the committee. I try to sort of stay out of it. This comes before the committee that I chair in the legislature, so I'll certainly have a whole lot to say about what we do then as well. But I want to encourage all the commission members, to the extent that they are willing to really think this through, go through all the materials that our amazing staff has put together for us, and remember the presentations that we have had. Look to other states, look to other solutions, and let's make sure that we have a complete record of all of the things that we might ask the people of the state of Maine to consider to solve this rather devastating crisis. So that's all I've got. Speaker Fecto?
Yeah, and I would just add that even if we're bringing forward ideas that might not necessarily get the votes of the commission in terms of majority, I still think it's important that every idea is brought to the table during the course of discussion, so we can have a really robust conversation about the numerous possible solutions that could be brought forward. So I don't want people to hesitate to bring something forward because they don't think it's the idea that's going to get the most number of votes from the commission, or it's not likely to pass the legislature if it were proposed in a bill. I think it's important that we really have a full discussion about a number of ideas. And I would just emphasize again, I don't think we're looking for like full memos like Commissioner Levine. I think, even if it's just a bullet point list of different actions that you think we could take as a commission, I think that's helpful. So I want to make sure that people don't feel like you're being overly burdened. I know we all have very busy lives, professional lives outside of the work of this commission. And so I think what's most important is bringing the top line idea so we can have a full conversation next week that consumes, a good portion of our day and really allows us to have the kind of exercise that I think this commission has been gearing up for based on all the meetings we've had to this point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Commissioner Spalding, did you have anything to say? Okay, great. Again, Hillary and Sam and Deirdre, you all were put to task very quickly, and you have over-delivered. And on behalf of the commission, I just want to say thank you very much. I know your work is not over and it will continue to be great, but just you've set us up to have a great discussion, and we appreciate it very much. Could not do it without you. Is there any other comment from the commission? I see a few things in the chat. Let me just make sure I'm crossing T's and dotting I's. Yep, thank you, Commissioner Pingree. We've done that. Okay, with that, I will say, Commissioner Jackson, thank you.
I know it was brought up earlier, but Commissioner Dan Brennan did send out some information for us to look at on the demographics that I had requested. I think it's important for all of us to consider this as we're moving forward and who will be most impacted by our decisions.
Thank you, Commissioner Jackson. And thank you, Commissioner Brennan, for making sure that we had that request fulfilled. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Seeing none, the commission meeting stands adjourned until next Thursday at 1 o'clock. Thank you all for your participation.